audio check 1 2 check 1 2 3 check audio check 1 2 check 1 2 1 2 3 check 1 2audio check 1 2 check 1 2 Check 1 2 3 check 1. Check, 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 check. Check 1, check 1 2. Check, check, final check, check 1 2, final check.
seated here already. Yeah, I think it's easier. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Please take a seat. We're going to start shortly. Interpretation? No, I think that's just if you want to hear each other or the ones on the ground. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, before we start, we would like to ask for the representatives of the Russian embassy. There's a mild issue with your parking, so can you please accompany Kanda to the entrance and she'll help you solve that. I don't know exactly what it was, but please follow her. I hope they're not towing your car, yes. Okay, everyone, good morning to the second day of the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum. I know it's early. Some of you might have mistaken the time. We're starting the plenary a little late, so unfortunately that you might lose a few minutes on your lunch break, but we're trying to keep on track on time. We have an extremely busy day, so this is a little bit on all the events that are happening. It's the second day, but it's as packed as yesterday. So we have sessions. We have 2 plenary sessions this morning, and then we have a coffee break. We go to our deep dive sessions, and then later we break into 2 other parallel sessions and conclude with a plenary session here back in CR1 before we take off. So this is the plan. I'm going to walk you through it again before we break for the parallel sessions, but please take note that your attention to the time today will be extremely important, so we're able to cover all the topics in the agenda and not have further delays. I just want to bring another reminder for you to keep on tweeting. Your performance yesterday was excellent. There has been some excellent tweets going on, like, for example, this one here from Sarah about the squirrels in the compound. So please keep tweeting, and if you use the hashtag, you may be featured here on the next intervention. So, and you can also see yourself through this tweet from the ILO on the group photo. As you can see, some of us are more featured than others. Pete, you're there. But you can see yourself, you can get some of the pictures. So keep on tweeting and using the hashtag, and also sharing the link for the webcast with your friends in your networks, because this will be important for us to take these conversations out of this room. Well, with no further ado, since we're already late, I am pleased to welcome our first panel. They already took their seats, which is great. And our first panel is on promoting responsible business and human rights in global trade and investment. This panel will focus on international trade and investment policy and how this has been brought in the recent issues and the issues of more is better, on a greater emphasis on the quality of the investment from countries. It will be moderated by Anita Ramasastry from the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And we have as panelists Hilde Hardeman, Director and Head of Service for the Foreign Policy Instruments of the European Union, Yang Tai Kim, Secretary General for the International Transport Forum, Stephen Olsen, Research Fellow for the Heinrich Foundation, Tan-Sin Lim, Director General for the Directorate of Investment and Company Administration, Ministry of Investment and Foreign Economic Relations from Myanmar, Gerald Sun, Senior Vice President for Strategic Growth from the Asia Pacific of MasterCard, and Ben van Peterstraat, Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator from Clean and Clothes Campaign. So over to you, Anita. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Victoria, for that warm welcome, and good morning to all of you, and thank you for coming out early for this opening session. We are missing one of our panelists, Gerald Sun, so hopefully we can find him and he's not dealing with the Russian parking situation. But this panel, and I think I'm moderating it because at a different point in my life, I was a trade negotiator, so I have some vague reference or recollection of what that was like, but I'm an academic and a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. My interest in this topic is that the working group implements the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and Guiding Principle 9, which most of you probably have not memorized, but we have, focuses on policy coherence in which governments deal with trade and investment agreements and having those align with the guiding principles, not only just internal policy making. So I'm curious to hear from the speakers today and from all of you about how we connect human rights to trade and investment. But the larger issue is that we're all committed to the SDGs and sustainable development, and so we're all trying to figure out how we can unlock the potential of trade and investment in a sustainable manner to promote inclusive growth globally. And all of our regions and all of us are really trying to figure out how to step up to this challenge. So while there's been excellent research by UNDP, the ILO, the OECD, UNCTAD, many of these partners who are here today, the question is how do we turn all of that research into action and to further sustainable growth? So our panel today is not just about trade and investment agreements. We'll focus on those, but those are the starting point, right? Once you have agreements in place, we have to deal with trade and investment promotion, and we also have to deal with trade facilitation, that without things like payments and infrastructure, trade's not going to work. So the question is, how do we embed sustainability throughout the trade and investment ecosystem? And that's what our experts, our distinguished panel, will help us figure out. So as we're looking today at the headlines, there are many key events. There's the rise in the ever-increasing number of trade agreements, and of course within this region we have the ASEAN FTA and Vision 2025 and the Common Effective Preferential Tariff Scheme. We have issues in the news about trade conflicts and protectionism. We have the EU focusing in its negotiations, and we'll hear about that in a moment, on sustainable trade and having chapters focusing on sustainability and the environment. More free trade agreements have labor and social clauses in them. And of course, what I'm pleased to see and hope that that will lead to more of the guiding principles in trade agreements is that the CPTPP, right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other agreements have what we call CSR, or Corporate Social Responsibility Clauses. So inviting business very explicitly into the conversation about what is their responsibility as well. So to me, that's an innovation, and I hope we'll talk about that. And then of course, we'll also talk a little bit about conditionality, right, and the idea of asking other trading partners to live up to certain commitments they've made nationally and internationally through conditionality. And of course, what's happening with respect to the EU and Cambodia is an example of that. But I'll just end here and say that the WTO and the Human Rights Council are both in Geneva. They're two major institutions right down the street from one another, but yet their engagement and dialogue is not very strong, right? So that there still are bridges and gaps that we have to bridge. So I'll leave this and start by saying how can and should trade and investment agreements take into account human rights, responsible business conduct and sustainability, and what are the models and options and what more can governments do to marry these different agendas? And how can enablers of trade, infrastructure, transport, and payments, these are the keys to unlocking the potential of trade, also address sustainability and human rights. With that, I'll turn to our very first speaker, and of course you've heard from Victoria about who our excellent panel are, but we'll really kick off with Dr. Hilda Hardeman to ask about, again, we sometimes forget that the EU is already itself an internal trading, it's an internal market, right? It's created a trading bloc. So the question, Dr. Hardeman, for you is, in terms of promoting responsible business conduct internally within the EU, but also externally in your trade agreements and investment agreements with partner countries, how have you embedded policy and achieved policy coherence when it comes to trade and sustainability and responsible business conduct?
It works. Thank you very much for that question, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would, of course, like to thank the OECD for organizing this forum and all of you for being present here to discuss such a very important topic. Responsible business conduct is something that is part of the European Union's DNA. If we look at the Treaty of Rome that established at the time the European Economic Community, it's all already there, and that treaty dates from 1958. We speak about the importance of a social market economy, of labor rights, of gender equality, 1958, don't forget that, of respect for the environment. So these aspirations to these big principles have been at the basis of the way in which European Union countries deal with each other since the very start, and it has also been at the basis of the way in which we deal with the outside world. And I dare to say that the EU walks the talk. Fair and ethical business is really at the basis of how business is conducted in the European Union, and we see also an increasing request from our consumers for fair and ethical products, which means that this also creates business opportunities, not only for companies and entrepreneurs in the European Union, but also outside. So if it's well understood, responsible business conduct actually is a factor that can lead to win-win for everyone involved, and that can create more opportunities. How do we handle that? Internally in the European Union, principles of responsible business conduct can be found in all our policies, and I think I'll have the occasion to come back to that later in the panel. In our work outside of the European Union, we embed responsible business conduct principles in our international trade agreements, in the way that we deal with incoming flows of goods and of services. And the basis for these principles are, on the one hand, of course, the big principles that are enshrined in our own treaties, but then also the international policy declarations from the United Nations, from the OECD, from the ILO. Coherence and consistency is key, and I'll be happy to come back on more specific elements later on in the panel. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hardeman. Dr. Kim, to look at, again, the enabling environment and transport and infrastructure, congratulations to you on your election as Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. So you represent an intergovernmental organization with 60 member countries, so your reach is very wide, and you're the only body that covers all transport modes. So again, wide reach: roads, rails, aviation, maritime, freight, urban, non-urban, so really the whole field. So how, again, does transport matter for sustainable trade and investment from your perspective in ITFs? And what role can transport authorities have to address the issues of impacts to people and the planet, and how can you further the sustainability agenda?
Good morning, everyone. My election is not recent. I got elected 2 years ago, so it's been already, this is my third year, because we just finished the annual summit 2 weeks ago in Leipzig. But anyway, thank you for the question. And from the transport point of view, transportation means already moving goods or services from one point to another. So it's essentially connected to the notion of trade. And especially the theme of the summit 2019 of ITF was connectivity. So connectivity means something that is strictly related to trade issues and investment as well. But we are not a regulator. We are not the informal body who adopts resolution. Unlike EU or UN, we just activate discussions in the transport sector. But the question is that so far transport focused more on the technological aspect. So we try to connect the physically and try to identify the missing links on the corridor on the Eurasian continent, for example. But nowadays we are trying to combine different aspects of transport to the traditional notion of transport, approaches. So we are now starting to discuss gender issue and also discuss, human rights issue, and discuss also, technical issue, innovation, digital, environment. So in this context, I think it's really meaningful for me to participate in this, different types of the discussions today to find some common area for which we can work together in the future. So the Transport Forum, ITF, and also transport, the sector, the players in the world, they can always think about different aspects of transport to bring a multidimensional the approaches to the transport sector. So I think if if we combine this approach properly with the trade or investment on human rights discussions, we can surely create some synergies. Especially these days, we are focusing on 5 main topics in the ITF. For example, digitalization, decarbonization, and connectivity, and universal access, and safety and security. They are very important, but every item is really difficult to manage. So I think this kind of multi-dimensional aspect of transport question is really difficult, but also we have to work on it together. So we might come back.
Great. Thank you very much. And Dr. Lun, if we focus now on investment, so there's trade, there's trade facilitation, and then there's inward attraction and investment. So as Director General of the Directorate of Investment and Company Administration, you oversee investment promotion and investment agreement negotiations as well, and also deal with company registrations. So what role can the Myanmar government and your agency do to promote responsible and sustainable business conduct?
Good morning, everyone. So it's a long story. So Myanmar have from 1988 to 2011 as a military regime, and from 2011 to 2015, the new government, and now the democratic government is existing. So the Myanmar situation is for the investment, especially for the foreign direct investment, to emphasize. Our department is also the Directorate of Investment and Company Administration, normally the Company Registry Department, but we have official form from the President degree, the commissions for Myanmar Investment Commissions, we call MIC. It's formed by the 1989 to here. And the regime of current government, the national economic policy aiming to foster the sustainable development, which is inclusive and people-centered, it's been said. So the government control and handle for the economic policy for according to our government. So Myanmar is taking the multi-dimensional reform measures aimed to the liberalizing, promotion, and facilitation trade and investment in order to create more attractive investor-friendly environment. So these situations, we have the new government make another policy for Myanmar Sustainable Development Policy. So it's in consisting of 3 pillars, 5 goals, 28 strategies, and not less than 251 action plans. It's firmly aligned with the global sustainable development goals. It is essential to create a favorable, predictable, facilitative, and friendly business climate broadly. So the situation is, our commission is under control by the MSDB, and we have many reforms. So I already mentioned about the long history. So in 2015, we have a competition law. In 2016, Myanmar investment law. 2017, Myanmar company laws. And just now, we have a Myanmar investment promotion plan, so aided by JIGA, and we have new policies and the plans, and we have to make for the sustainable development of the investment rules. So I would like to sharing about the investment policy a little bit. So the investment policy is support to the implementation of the Myanmar's 12 points economic policy. Responsible and mutually beneficial foreign investment are welcome. Local and foreign investors shall comply with the principle for responsible and business conduct, including the relation, environmental, and neutral resources matters. So we are follow the many instructions and many rules and many regulations, and we have many principles. So the new Myanmar Investment Commission increased emphasis on business identifying and mitigating the environmental and social impacts and operation sustainably. According to the Myanmar Investment Law, rules 196 and 199, the investors have submitted their annual reports and have to be allowed to publish then on the website. It's more transparent than others. The objectives of Myanmar investment laws and rules are to develop responsible investment which do not cause harm to the natural environment and the social environment for the interests of the union and the citizens. So the Myanmar Investment Commission, we handle for the investors. And if you want to invest in the Myanmar investment law, under the Myanmar investment law, you can submit to the Myanmar Investment Commission. Myanmar Investment Commission emphasizes the responsible and valuable investment. So we have more critical to the others times. How to check the investors? We will check for EMP, EIA, SIA, and to how impact to the Myanmar citizens. So according to Myanmar investment rules, the investor has respected ethnic custom traditions, obtain all necessary permits under the other laws, operate responsible by abiding by the laws and best international standard, avoid damage, pollution, and loss the natural and social environment, and not to cause damage to the culture heritage. So this is very significant of our investment commission to emphasize the responsible business in Myanmar. So our department is under the Myanmar Investment Commission. For me, I am the secretary of the Myanmar Investment Commission, and we also handle the responsible business in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing the details and the different ways in which both social and environmental issues are actually embedded in your investment law and process. We'll now turn to Stephen Olson, who is an expert who can help us, I think, understand some of these trends better. So Stephen, from your perspective, increasingly trade agreements have more labor and sustainability, and we've heard about the EU human rights provisions, and labor rights being perhaps the most significant. So from your perspective, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of these approaches? And maybe you can explain to us in particular conditional elements of preferential trade agreements. How do those work in practice and in theory?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Anita, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Heinrich Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting sustainable global trade, I'd like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should probably preface my comments with a bit of a disclaimer. Unlike a large portion of the people in the room here today, I'm definitely not a developmental expert. I'm a trade policy guy. I'm a trade policy wonk. I'm a former U.S. trade negotiator. And for better or for worse, that's the perspective that I'll be bringing to our discussions this morning. Now, all of us are living through a period of unprecedented turmoil in the global trading system. We've got the most significant trade war in, I would argue, almost 100 years. We've got the United States abdicating its traditional leadership role in international trade. And for the first time, literally in 7 decades, we've got people actively questioning whether or not the rules-based multilateral trade system is going to continue to be viable or not. And civil societies in all of the countries that all of us come from are now increasingly focused on trade and increasingly passionate about trade. And so what that means, in particular in democracies, is that trade has become politicized. And let's be honest, in some countries it's become very, very, very politicized. So when we talk about trade agreements, when we talk about labor, I guess the clearest thing I can say is it's complicated. And I really want to thank and acknowledge all of the organizations and the institutions here for the good work that you're doing in trying to help us unpack, understand, and address more appropriately these complicated issues. I'm a supporter of your efforts. I'm a fan of your efforts. And as a supporter and as a friend, I wanted to share some very candid thoughts with you about what, from my point of view, is working well, and some things, perhaps more importantly, that might not be working so well. So as a member of the U.S. negotiating team for literally the first free trade agreement to contain labor provisions, I have a confession that I need to make. The labor provisions in that agreement literally are not worth the piece of paper that they're printed on. Not worth the paper that they're printed on. They largely pledge countries to live up to regulations and laws they already have on the books, and the enforcement, frankly speaking, is a joke. Now, over the years, there's been increasing pressure, largely as a result of civil society, to include these provisions more frequently in free trade agreements. And they're much more common and, in fact, becoming at least a bit more substantive. Today, arguably at least, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the most advanced agreement when it comes to labor provisions, and that's an encouraging thing. But I do think we need to kind of take a deep breath and reflect a little bit on the underlying premise behind including labor provisions. The unstated premise behind the inclusion of these provisions is that developing countries can be nudged, can be cajoled, can be encouraged to improve their labor conditions based on the threat of having their trade benefits removed or having trade sanctions placed on them. The basic proposition that developing countries are being confronted with is, if you would like to join this free trade agreement, or if you would like to continue to receive benefits under this current agreement, you need to improve your labor conditions, or else your access to trade will be, and your access to trade benefits will be to one degree or another constricted. I think we need to reflect a little bit on that, because the one thing that we've seen as we've pursued progressively freer trade over the past 7 decades is that trade-driven economic growth is one of the most effective engines to propel countries towards higher labor standards. And if that's the case, does it make sense to take the ladder away, the ladder that so many countries have used to climb their way towards better standards? It's no coincidence that the Sustainable Development Goals talks about trade so much and talks about trade as an engine for improving labor and other sustainability issues. Now, when I started my career as a trade negotiator, the labor conditions in East Asia were considerably more challenging than they are today. And 2 countries in particular had especially abysmal, horrific sweatshop labor conditions. Those 2 countries were South Korea and Taiwan. Now, of course, as everybody sitting in this room here today understands, these are 2 countries which today have labor standards that arguably could compare favorably to almost any country in the world. And at the same time, both of these countries are textbook case examples of economic development through trade. Do we think that's a coincidence, or do we think there's a correlation? And if we think there's a correlation, my suggestion would be think carefully before we take away that ladder that so many countries that are now trying to follow the example of Taiwan, Korea, and others are using to climb their way towards better labor standards, labor provisions. What works well? Capacity building. Capacity building, both technological advice and money, extremely important. And I think also these impact assessments can be very useful, because as a starting point, we have to understand what the situation is and what the likely impact is. But my advice would be, let's be cautious before we take away that ladder that so many countries have used effectively to climb their way towards better labor and sustainability provisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe in the second round, you can reflect a little bit on impact assessments, because those also relate back to the guiding principles of many things, this concept of human rights and social impact assessments. And of course, the EU engages in that and requires that as well of its partners. So Mr. Van Pepperstrate, I think you have really the same question to you, but from a civil society perspective, about trade agreements, including sustainability, human rights, and labor provisions and chapters. And do they work from your perspective in practice, and from civil society's view, how can they be strengthened?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to speak here and be on the panel. Well, to a certain extent, from the perspective of civil society, there's a very mixed view, also because among civil society, so I work for the Clean Clothes Campaign, we have a specific view on labor rights in trade relations. But I think the broader segment of civil society has quite a palette of views. But I think where we all converge is that indeed trade agreements and trade arrangements can open up a lot of opportunities, but equally have the possibility to negatively impact or even exacerbate some of the weaknesses of some of the countries participating in either bilateral or multilateral schemes. So that concept of an engine, which I think speaks very strongly to also our analysis, can be both a positive one and a negative one. And I think the whole question is, how do we make sure that it is a positive way forward? And there we think that the picture is actually much more nuanced. We do recognize that trade can bring elements, can bring improvements, but at the same time we also see that negative impacts can actually be worse. To a certain extent, because we've been focusing quite a lot on labor rights. In some countries, labor rights situation actually deteriorated, but also because we don't focus on a number of other human rights impacts that are not necessarily covered within the labor rights provisions. So if we see now the institutional response to this criticism that increased trade also harbors an increased risk for human rights violations, we see that, for example, sustainability chapters are being added more frequently, that the GSP systems have a list of conventions that they want to see progress on, that we also need to reflect on, is that list of references that we use still up to date in the 21st century. I think we can have a debate to enlarge that normative scope. I think the second element that was already touched upon is you can anticipate by the design of the trade agreement what kind of trade flows one would expect to see increased. So you can also, even before you start that increased trade, have an impact assessment on what are the kind of impacts that we are expected to see and start mitigating for them. So those impact assessments that you already referred to, we see those happening in practice, but they're certainly not common practice. It's not like we always use that, and that should be, those ex-ante human rights impact assessment should be a standard element in the whole process. It shouldn't be, oh, here we did it and here we didn't do it, because once you have those human rights impact assessments, you have a wealth of information to start thinking about, okay, how can we start mitigating some of these unintentional consequences on human rights situation, either by revisiting some of the elements within the trade agreement or looking at sort of supporting measures in terms of development cooperation, technical cooperation, the programming around that. That is certainly not mainstream practice yet, but nothing says that shouldn't become mainstream practice. We are actually very strong proponent that actually becomes mainstream practice even within, let's say, the EU GSP system. And out of that, we think that given that these agreements are negotiated constructs in nature between one or several parties, that also the whole ideas that are enshrined in these human rights conventions, ILO conventions, should also be subject to, I think, negotiating how that ladder that you referred to looks like. So the ILO conventions on freedom of association are very high level. And we think that we should also look a bit more like, okay, you're negotiating with a specific country, country X, the labor rights situation is how it is. What are the steps concretely to come from where that country is currently at that moment to be into compliance with core ILO standards, and not look at it necessarily from a high level, but look at very specific, okay, we need to adapt the regulation, we need to strengthen the judiciary, we need to maybe strengthen the capacity of the labor inspectorate, we need to look at trade union registration, all those more concrete and practical terms. We can sort of throw them into a roadmap or a ladder. Well, we use roadmaps, but I echo the sentiment. And we saw two of those constructs emerge recently, or that we actually looked at. One is the EU Bangladesh Sustainability Compact, where also the US joined later, and Canada, where they looked at those ILO conventions and fire and building safety, and really, together with Bangladesh, came up with a roadmap and a timetable. Okay, what are we doing concretely on that, practically, and by when? The other one that I want to mention is actually the US-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, which also has a whole chapter on how to bring Vietnam into compliance with ILO core conventions, and which actually for the first time since long gives a prospect that Vietnam will actually allow workers to join or form a union of their own choosing. For somebody who comes from a labor rights perspective in supply chains, especially garment supply chains, that's a big thing. I wouldn't have put my money on that 5 years ago, but it shows the promise if you go to a more detailed negotiated construct. It's not imposing upon Vietnam what to do, but it's speaking with Vietnam. Okay, by when do you think you can get there, and is this reasonable, and is this reasonable, and you come then to a common agreement that you can then later on use for, I think, and I'll conclude with that, the other point where I echo very much my neighbor, enforceability. You can hold people to account about, have you met this? Because by 2021 you said you were going to do this, but this is not happening. Why is this not happening? And you can look much more at that accountability, because I think that's maybe the biggest critique that comes from civil society in general when it comes to human rights in labor provision, in trade provisions, is that to a certain extent the sustainability chapters are unenforceable. Within the GSP system, there is enforceability on that.
Okay.
It's not triggered
Thanks.
by
I
third
think
party.
we'll come back to that in terms
But I
of
think
just
that's
the
the
next.
last element to strengthen the efficiency of the human rights
So
within trade.
we've heard about impact assessments, more specificity, and then enforceability. Mr. Sun, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're back to trade facilitation and payments, right? So in order for people to be able to trade, they actually need to be able to use payment mechanisms and in addition to accessing transport. So from your perspective, how can payments providers help enable trade and unlock the potential for SMEs and others in countries?
Thanks, Anita. First of all, I'd like to say I'm kind of really excited and grateful to be here. There are not many commercial enterprises or private companies here, and therefore it's especially gratifying to join this panel on a subject that, as a corporation and as an individual, we're really very passionate about, both trade as well as human rights. I'm probably going to call out the elephant in the room, and usually at these panels, people are wondering what MasterCard is doing here. But we are primarily a network that connects fragmented ecosystems. We started with the banks, and we're moving to other ecosystems, healthcare, transit, so on and so forth. And if you think about what we do, we actually digitally connect different players, allowing users and consumers to flow more seamlessly through them, taking down their costs, increasing access. If you think about e-commerce, a lot of trade has happened on the back of that. So Alibaba, AliExpress, all those stories that you hear that actually impact directly SMEs and enable them to participate have been on the back of networks like MasterCard. What I'd like to just, in syncing back with the comments from Stephen and Ben, is actually kind of point out that before I go into how we even facilitate trade to the next level and increase access to it, I'd just like to point out that if we're talking about human rights and we're talking about encouraging trade, we also invariably need to think about how the benefits of trade are actually accruing or cascading down to the people that are the engines of trade, the people in the garment factories and the electronic factories. Clearly there are a huge host of complex issues about whether people are ready to immediately jump to developed country standards of labor relations. But we live in quite an interesting time that because of technology, because of the internet and cloud computing and mobile computing, there are many things that can be done within these markets to start the ball rolling, to get the groundswell of transformation to happen from the ground. And I'll give an example of a project that we're involved in Cambodia around garment workers. And it was phenomenal to me. They're predominantly female. They come in once a month. They come into the factory for their pay. So they come and get their pay or salary. At the gates, you see a group of men generally. These are their husbands, uncles, fathers, brothers, boyfriends. And they're kind of like a toll system. So these women come by and they get essentially their pay taken away. and they need the rest of their day off with whatever they have left. They're actually going around town making payments. And they're making utility payments. They're paying for schools. They're paying for all these things to actually sustain the family for the rest of the month. Now you think about it, it was great for them to have a paycheck. And it was great for them to have employment. And it was great, and we are looking at the conditions within the factory. But let's not forget about the conditions outside of the factory, right? That, you know, when I first saw this, I was actually thinking about how baby turtles hatch and make a dash for the ocean, and on the way there are all these predators, and that's what that felt like to me, right? And the factory, by comparison, felt safer than the streets that they had to contend with after leaving the factory. And so what I want to wrap up is, on this point is just sharing that we need to think about this more holistically, but not, you know, we live in a time right now that we don't have to just talk about it. Many of you have mobile wallets and cash, and essentially that's what's being done. We're paying the money digitally to women, and through their mobile wallets, they can make their school payments, they can make their utility payments, and before they meet the barbarians at the gate, all that can be settled, right? So actually thinking about how we can help them transform their lives, not just in terms of the paycheck that they're getting, but how they can stay in control of that paycheck and how women can be empowered is also very interestingly part of that conversation. Now, the reason why this is so important and linked to what Stephen and Ben have said is that if you get that actually right, you tremendously increase the status of women, right? And through that process, in 10 years, in 20 years, you will transform these markets, these countries from within. And that's lasting transformation, right? That's what we talk about in Taiwan and Korea. The population themselves, no one's going to accept these sweatshop conditions anymore. But they have en masse been given the tools to be more productive, to be more empowered, to you know, raise standards within their families and to educate the people around them. You see, so that I think is the crux, and how we actually partner to do this is also extremely important, right? But you know, I think there are a myriad of ways, and I'm not going to talk about this here, because I think if you open any kind of media, you'll be hearing about .coms and techs and hackathons and startups, and there's a whole bunch of people that are trying to solve for this right now. Coming back to Anita's point on enablement, I think we all can agree that giving small enterprises access to global trade invariably leads to an increase in GDP and, more importantly, an increase in employment. And that's why we're all really passionate and excited about trade. Even though most of us have not actually followed a cargo container ship or seen it unload, we're still very passionate about it because of these themes. What we need to also realize is that, by and large, SMEs are excluded from trade today, right? And I say that because even though, you know, we're big partners with Ali and many of the marketplaces that are actually driving trade today, if you were an SME trying to get involved in trade today, there are a lot of barriers. The first thing that you would find is that if you went to a bank and said, I want to make, you know, I've got this invoice accepted for $50,000 worth of goods that I want to manufacture, you know, will you support me? And the answer is invariably that will come from banks, if you're less than 100,000, is going to be no, right? And we see that from studies, right? ADB did a study and said 86% or so of bank loan trade loan rejections are from SMEs. And the fundamental issue is not because the banks don't want to support the SMEs. The fundamental issue is a disconnect between how we do things and what we want to do, right? It costs a bank somewhere around $3,000 or more to actually run through the administrative process of granting a trade loan. The average ticket of an SME transaction on Alibaba is somewhere between $20,000 to $50,000. So if you think about it, I want a $20,000 loan, I'm in a developing country, it costs you $3,000 to process. Doesn't seem like a very good business proposition, right? This is even before any profits accrue. And that's why they're, you know, they have small quantities, and therefore nobody wants to deal with the administration of dealing with them. accept other SMEs. But if you're an SME and you want to grow your enterprise, you don't have cash sitting around and the banks are going to say no. These things need to be solved in order to create a groundswell of SME participation. And there are a couple of adjacent items. The other adjacent item is really matching demand and allowing SMEs to either buy or sell globally, right? And I think everybody is here has heard about Alibaba and all the other fantastic B2B marketplaces. They've done really well on B2C. Thank God for them. I don't have to go to a shopping center and worry about parking and all that rest of the stuff anymore, as much as I used to have to do. But if you're on a marketplace for B2B, you get product and price discovery, and then everything else is offline, right? They're basically directory services. You then go to the traditional bank, you sort out your logistics and all this kind of stuff. It's not easy for an SME, even given when they have these marketplaces. And the other issue about the marketplaces is that they all have their proprietary systems, right? So if you want to get eyeballs or get distribution, you essentially have to sign up to 5 or 20 of them to make sure you get access to markets. Now, when you contrast this with what we know about SMEs, which is that there's a massive digital divide between SMEs and large corporations, right? SMEs still think, electronic invoice is punching something out on Excel. And that's really great because a lot of them are still using paper invoicing, if at all. There is also there are two associated problems, right? Access through marketplaces that are inclusive and open, and the associated problem of capability building with the SME to try to get them onto these platforms in a meaningful manner, right? Now, we may not think that it's an issue getting on a platform because, you ask someone, how difficult is it to be a buyer or seller on eBay? And you just go through one-page registration process and voila, you're there, right? Yeah, that's if you're, selling off your kids' clothes and pram and all that kind of stuff. It's easy enough. But if you're trying to actually run a business and you're trying to do it at scale, this doesn't work very well, right? What this means is that you've got a digital front shop and everything else behind is run by a bunch of mice. It's extremely manual, right? So you're thinking, great, it's manual because then that drives employment, right? Because more people can get employed. But what drives benefits is actually productivity improvements as well as employment, right? So we've got to tackle these hand in hand. Why is it so difficult to tackle this hand in hand, right? Why is it so difficult for SMEs to go online? Answer is actually pretty simple. It's not an issue of technology, and also it's not an issue of money, interestingly. It sometimes is, but the big problems aren't money. The big problems are for SMEs to be able to integrate technology into what they do in a meaningful manner. And I'll explain that with a very simple example. I happen to have a small ownership.
I was going to say, maybe we can get back to that in the next round.
Okay.
That just in terms of, for interest of time.
Thanks.
So Dr. Hardiman, back to you. I think, again, you were going to briefly talk to us a little bit about how the EU has accomplished, right, in terms of embedding the sustainability and human rights into trade agreements. How has that worked in practice? And then as you think about other regions and you think about ASEAN and what it's going through now, what lessons and recommendations do you have as we think about this in other places?
Thank you very much. Well, I have found the contributions of the other panel members very interesting, very helpful, very thought-provoking, and also very much in line with our own experience. I think, like on anything in life, if you really want to achieve something, you have to be coherent and you have to be consistent. You have to pursue the matter from all angles in everything you do, and you have to make sure that you involve all stakeholders, build ownership if needed, help them to develop their capacity. And that's exactly what has been ongoing within the European Union. If you look at where our different member states came from when they joined the European Union and when they stand today, then I think we have seen an incredible surge in terms of responsible business conduct. And we try to do the same with our trading partners and with our partners across the world. So we embed indeed elements of responsible business conduct in our trade agreements. The negotiation process of those agreements is an exercise in itself that we accompany with capacity building. You may ask, capacity building in negotiations, why would you strengthen your negotiating partner? But we believe that those agreements can only be effective if the other side really understands what are the concepts that they are signing up to, what do they mean, and so we work both with the governments, we work with business in our partner countries, we work with civil society so as to make sure that everyone involved in the negotiations, also the civil society side, really has a good view of what it is that we are negotiating, what it will imply. We learn from each other in that process, and then when it comes to implementation, so building partnerships with partner countries, with international organizations across the world is crucial. We are having a big program running at this moment in Asia with 6 countries. Thailand is one of them, China, Japan, the Philippines, Myanmar is one of them, and the 6th country for the moment escapes me. And in that program, we work again with all the actors to build capacity. This is leading to concrete results, government signing up to certain aspects, but also businesses getting a better view. So on the whole, a holistic approach in which what interests you is the final outcome. As Stephen has said, I wouldn't go as far as you go to say that the provisions of the agreements are not the key thing. They are one of the key things, but they are only a tool to achieve other means. They're not a purpose in themselves. And as Ben has said so well, it's then the follow-up, the fact that you discuss with the countries, with your partners, that you if something goes wrong, that you try to see, okay, what has happened, like we had in the case of Bangladesh, what can we do to make progress on that? And there, I am really, how would I say, encouraged by hearing how all the different members of this panel, coming all from different angles, come to the same conclusion. For me, it's just basic common sense. It's just the basic way in which human beings and our economies function. We need to look at the issue from all angles and push at it in the same direction. So if you want to ask me, do I have one lesson to share? I think just like we have seen in the European Union, like we see in our trade negotiations, in our partnerships, you need a holistic approach. You need to bring everyone in. You need to bear these concepts in mind in whatever you do. And the concepts themselves, they are, let's face it, they're not rocket science. For me, they are about the basic principles that every human being knows about. We should not destroy our environment. We should treat other people with respect. We should give other people the possibility to develop, and the cake is as big as we make it. This is not a zero-sum game, but it is a real-life example of a win-win. If we all work in that direction, each from our position, each within our possibilities, then we can create a real win-win for everyone. And that's what we must do, and we need to work for that every day, in everything we do. I think that's very simple, and we can all contribute to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, in terms of focusing again back to the ITF and looking at transport, how has the ITF dealt with human rights, sustainability, and climate change risks in the transport sector? And climate change in particular, I presume, is a top priority. So what are the concrete steps or recommendations coming from the ITF?
That's a very interesting and good question. Thank you, Anita. I think we are trying to contribute to our member countries because since 2015, when Paris Agreement was adopted in the COP21 conference in Paris, a lot of countries made commitment more concretely the level of reduction in the emission issue. But the question is how? There was also the question that I faced when I was in the Ministry of Transport, because I was the head of the division responsible for that issue. But basically the question is the fact that the negotiators on that topic were mostly Ministry of Environment people. And basically when they finish it, negotiation, they come back to the government and they try to distribute the task and homework. So suddenly we got homework. But how was the question? It was very difficult. But we knew that there are two different approaches, one for technological aspect, the other for the behavior changing aspect. But technological aspect is relatively simple because we can introduce more efficient engine, efficient system, efficient motors and something like that. But changing behaviors of the citizens is really difficult, and we don't really know the quantifiable, the impact of every measure we can use. So basically, when I came to the ITF 2 years ago, ITF was already starting to deal with this question, but it seemed to me too huge and too, in a sense, a little bit ambiguous. So I discussed with my staff members, and I proposed that we should bring a more evidence-based analysis, and we have to provide our member countries with more concrete, quantifiable impact of every measure, and we should not take a normative approach. We cannot say this is right or wrong, because every country is in different situation. So maybe we can provide some objective analytic outcomes so that they can choose and make a good combination of different policy measures. But if the measure doesn't really work, maybe we can ask other questions to find out more about why, and so things like that. So if I come back to the question of trade, mostly we start our discussion thinking that trade is a good thing. In a sense, it's right, because when we think about Ricardo, the economist of the the school of economics, when he proposed this notion, that means that we can have mutual benefits by exchanging something, one that is rare in this country and one that is common in the country. So by exchanging two things, we can make good things together. But recently, we hear two different concepts with the same word, trade and trade war. So war, is it good or not? Basically, war is bad. But why we make war with a good notion of trade? So we have to think about as well. So basically, in this kind of the international discussions on trade and investment and exchanges, we can build a consensus by exchanging best practices. And I think this is another type of trade in the sense that we are making a higher level of consensus. So we are trying our best, and ITF Secretariat is not dominating the discussions. We are supporting the member countries. So basically, member countries, they try to reach a consensus of high level.
Thank you very much. And again, focusing on how you achieve that consensus in all of these areas of trade facilitation. And Dr. Nguyen, in terms of your work, right? So you've spoken about the legal framework, but what about the day-to-day? In terms of FDI promotion, do you target responsible and sustainable businesses to come to Myanmar? And what other priorities and goals do you have in terms of promoting responsible business?
So as I told you earlier, we have many plans. So for investment point of view, I would like to introduce Myanmar Investment Promotion Plan, which comes from ADB, support from ADB. It's started by 2011 at 11-12. So FDIPP, Foreign Direct Investment Promotion Plans. But suddenly the government changed. Our economic policy change, investment policy change, so that we have a new Myanmar investment promotion plans. So this is the modified for the foreign direct investment plan. So we have a new Myanmar investment promotion plan. According to our investment promotion plan, we formed the investment promotion committee head by our investment commission chairman. And then our Myanmar investment promotion plan is emphasized to the 30 years plans. So, 20 years plans from 2015 to 2023. So first 5-year plan, we have targeted $5 billion FDI income to our country, and the next 5 years is 6.8, and next 5 year 11, and next 5 years 17 billion for our target. So this is our investment promotion plans, and we formed, according to the Myanmar investment promotion plan, we formed to the investment promotion committee. So in Myanmar, we have many old laws and old regulations, so we are facing. So that if you investment in Myanmar, for example, the energy sector, so if you want to go, you need to go Ministry of Energy first, and then the Ministry of Environment, and then the local authorities. So that we need to cooperation and coordination with others relevant ministries. So our Myanmar investment promotion plan, according to our Myanmar investment promotion plan, we have investment promotion committee to handle for all the states and regions and all the ministries. So this is the plan for the investment promotions. So that's all.
Thank you very much. Gerald, I'm going to come back to you, and you were going to help us, I think, understand, how do we overcome this challenge? So we need SMEs to facilitate trade.
Yeah, so just coming back to the point, if we're going to enable SMEs, we need platforms that they can get on, and platforms that are interconnected. And the idea is kind of simple. If I'm on Lazada in Singapore or Indonesia, I want to be able to buy or sell from Flipkart in India, right? How do we actually facilitate that connection so that marketplaces are open rather than proprietary? So that's one thing that a lot of people are working to try to solve. Aside from opening up trade financing, there's also this big conversation that my fellow panelists have talked about, which is really about capability building, right? And how do you convince SMEs? So that's what we're going to stress on how do you convince SMEs to go digital, because it's extremely daunting for them. It's not a matter of capital, but it's really more a matter of how do they adopt technology and how do they integrate technology. I'll explain this through a restaurant example. In many countries now, with the advent of these cloud service providers, here in Singapore, in Malaysia, you can get Grab Food, and a host of other competitors that will actually do delivery from your restaurant to your home, which is a great thing, and does drive business. But the challenge is, if you look at every restaurant, there are like 4 tablets and iPads in front of the cashier, right? And being a technology guy, I said, okay, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to call up all these 4 guys, and I'm going to call up the cashier, the POS vendor, and I'm going to say, you guys need to talk to one another. I had zero joy. Like, this was the worst sales outcome ever. All the technology, all the cloud guys said, look, you're too small, you're just one restaurant. It's not worth the effort to plumb to you. And even though I managed to convince my technical vendor, no one wanted to do it. But here's the problem, right? So there is demand coming in, so you kind of see it, it's like marketplaces, but it's not integrated with what you do. And what we do is actually integrated in the back end, like the orders that you key in goes there. So if you just introduced additional work for a staff, they go like, how's this digital? I'm like looking at something and I'm rekeying it in. Compared to a conventional order, I kind of do it once, right? Now I do it twice. And there's this opportunity for me to make a mistake when I do it. And so very often, people don't get what they want delivered because what's keyed in is actually not what's there. And that's a good example of the issue we have with SMEs. They don't have a CTO or CIO to plumb and put all these things together. They also don't have the scale to be able to work with their vendors and say, please help me with my menagerie of applications and technology, and put it together so that my different departments can work together. And so they invariably, even if they go on this technology a path, it's very, very difficult because the departments are digital, but they're connected by paper and analog means. And the next time you go to the owner of this business and you say invest in technology and go digital, they go, I'm running both a digital and an analog system, my costs are now double, right? And I don't actually see the benefits. So I'm giving that example to try to explain that while there's a lot of focus on laws and there's a lot of focus on enabling platforms, most countries, including the developed ones, are really struggling on trying to get traditional, multi-generational, second, third generational SMEs to adopt technology, right? It's not all SMEs, right? Millennials who come and graduate, they're on their mobile phones to do HR and accounting, and they're digital by default. They're born digital. But they're not the majority of companies, right? So most of the companies that we're talking about that would be engaged in trade, in manufacturing, actually fall in the other bunch, where they really struggle to go digital. And if we don't fix this aspect, it'll continue to be a challenge. We're going to have a stop and start, and real productivity gains are going to be hard to achieve.
Thank you very much. And I'll come to Ben and then to Stephen to conclude, and then we'll have some time for questions. So Ben, one of the things we haven't talked about is civil society's role in all of this. If we're promoting sustainable, responsible trade and investment, what role can civil society play in terms of implementation, monitoring of commitments?
Well, we obviously believe that we have a big role to play because notably part of our core business is actually to monitor human rights violations and try to find a solution to them. So for us to exercise that function in the best conducive way within such a context is that we would also need to have the necessary transparency about what is happening in the bilateral discussions between the two states or the several states in the trade agreement. And we should have also, again, this concept of a roadmap helps us to organize in our own way, our view on progress and drive then that accountability. And I'm talking both as us being an Amsterdam and Brussels-based organization, but also about our network, which is global and in a lot of production context, where we see that unions and NGOs actually are very excited and see the whole space for trade as a huge opportunity to have a better discussion about labor rights implementation within their country. But I think in order to fully use that, we think we should equally develop a form of complaint mechanism within the trade agreement that is accessible for civil society. For example, in the EU GSP regulations, business has a complaint mechanism for anti-dumping. But as civil society, well, of course, we can send an email to the European Commission, and we, as the European Commission knows, we regularly do that. But, for example, the US GSP facility has a much more formal right of petition of civil society to raise specific issues where we think that the beneficiary country who gets conditionality is no longer going closer to the goals of being compliant with, let's say, core ILO standards, but actually is going away from that goal. So, but in order for that construct to work, you need to have then that transparency, that roadmap, that accountability, and at the end, the possibility to also launch a dispute and have maybe the possibility for a targeted consequence to that. Because for us, in essence, and that's maybe where the responsible business conduct angle comes in, we as Clean Clothes Campaign, our main interlocutor are brands. And we interact a lot with them, a lot in disputes, but also sometimes in dialogue. I know we disagree on a lot of matters, but we also do engage with brands on a lot of discussions. And if you then see, for example, because Bangladesh was mentioned, we saw earlier, well, the end of last year, the biggest crackdown on workers asking for a higher wage, which I think was a legitimate demand given the poverty wage and the net decrease in purchasing power that garment workers have in that country. That protest was met with an unprecedented crackdown from the government of Bangladesh in terms of judicial harassment, the factories blacklisted workers,
workers were fired, and that's already in a context where there was a problematic election, where human rights defenders and media and bloggers were intimidated and worse. And you see then that the brands that we approach are really faced with, in essence, a collective action problem. Like, single-handedly, they could not solve these issues. And even collectively, they're grasping how to solve these issues. We saw that very much in Cambodia, because, like, let's say we want to have all brands of Bangladesh together, we would need a whole Congress room and then even bigger. Cambodia, it was even much more manageable because you do fit all the brands who are sourcing from there in this room. And you could have a discussion on moving forward. And to a certain extent, following the wage protest in 2014, brands started doing that, having a collective engagement with the government of Cambodia. Listen, we want to continue here as doing business, but there are a number of problems with the repressive reaction to a wage protest. There are a number of problems with how the labor laws are evolving and how the practice under those labor laws are evolving. There are a lot of concerns about where the democracy is going and where free speech and free media are going. But even there, brands felt that they, just at their own volition, even if they used their combined forces, leverage and voice, could not necessarily buck that trend. And I think at that juncture in time, brands themselves started, in our discussions with us, look back to, well, we need to actually have discussions with the EU, we need to have discussions with the US, we need to have discussion with the diplomatic community in order to, for us, build also a platform around our own efforts to say, well, here are the labor rights that you committed to implementing and guaranteeing within your own system, but us, within our own efforts of responsible business conduct, we can no longer compensate or mitigate what is going on. And so we need at least a credible threat of possible consequences being launched here, that just to indicate that this course of action is no longer acceptable, even from a brand, community, and business perspective.
Well, thank you for that, Ben, and thank you for mentioning, I think, again, access to remedy, right? And so enforceability, but also giving civil society both a monitoring function and a voice. So, Stephen, I think wrap it up, and then we'll move to questions. We'll go a little bit past the hour, although I know Dr. Kim and others have some busy schedules, so we'll try to keep it tight. You are assessing, right, through the Heinrich Foundation and the Economist Intelligence Unit, you're actually looking at how well countries are doing with sustainability and trade. So would you tell us a little bit about the index and what that means and how countries are doing?
Sure. Thank you very much. For the purposes of our index, we define sustainable trade as engaging in international trade in a way that not only generates balanced economic growth, but also strengthens social capital and promotes environmental stewardship. Now, of course, as everybody else, as everyone in this room will recognize, that's not a definition we developed entirely on our own. It's derived from the UN Brundtland Commission with its 3 pillars of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental. And the basic message from the index is that although international trade is an indispensable ingredient in economic development, it cannot be pursued sustainably, and I would triple underline that word sustainably, unless there's an equivalent commitment to strengthening social capital and promoting environmental stewardship. Now, in terms of our most recent edition of the index, I'm afraid I've got a bit of distressing news to report. We did note a broad regression in the region in trade sustainability, particularly among some of the more wealthier countries. Broadly speaking, we saw continued gains under the economic pillar. However, these were more than offset by backsliding on the social and the environmental pillars. Now, of course, the $64,000 question, the big question, is this just a temporary blip generated by a series of one-off experiences, or is this the beginning of a more worrisome trend line? I don't have the vaguest idea. We're going to have to wait for our 2020 edition of the index to come out to see if we're continuing to head in that direction or if we're kind of getting ourselves back on track with trade sustainability in the region. I do want to, I've delivered that news, which I think is a bit concerning. I do want to mention some of the positive takeaways as well. One of the things in particular that I was heartened by is that we can see clearly that trade sustainability is not just a luxury for the wealthier countries. And in fact, we saw a couple of the lower and middle income countries really punching above their weight and really performing well. I would point to Vietnam and Sri Lanka in particular. And I think both these governments have correctly identified trade sustainability as an important economic competitiveness differentiator for them. And I think that's very positive and very encouraging. And then the last thing I will mention is that it's also very encouraging to see the leadership role being taken by private companies. I mean, I really have to say in a lot of instances, governments need to catch up to businesses. Businesses are way ahead, and in particular, some companies that have extended global supply chains. We're seeing an increasing number. First, we're seeing a trend from company-specific initiatives to industry-wide. That's great because it makes it more scalable, right? The other thing that we're seeing is companies are increasingly instituting codes of conduct into their supply chains, and then they are conducting audits to see how well the companies are living up to it. Now, not surprisingly, those companies that score well on these audits are getting more orders. Now, this is a profound shift that I don't want to get lost in the shuffle. This means that now sustainability is becoming an economic differentiator. It's helping companies win more business. 20 years ago, sustainability was considered like, well, that's a fluffy kind of CSR activity. It's nice if you can do it, great, good for you, but if you can't, so what? It doesn't matter. Those days are gone. Those days are gone. These sustainability activities are really being seen as a key economic competitiveness differentiator, and I think that's a very encouraging message.
Thank you for giving us that positive message in terms of where we are with sustainability and trade. We have time for questions, so I'll just open the floor. So we'll start. We have 2 questions here. And are there others? We'll take a round, so two more. We have one here, and is there anyone else for a fourth? We'll start with those 3. Surya?
Yeah. Good morning. I am from Nepal. My name is Anup Sharma. I belong to Human Rights Commission. I am the chairman of the Human Rights Commission in Nepal. I want to give my brief resume. I was lawyer for 30 years. I worked for the foreign investment many times. Basically, ASEAN, I cannot compare with the ASEAN situation. It is a different situation for me. In Nepal, the foreign investment is a lucrative business was. But nowadays, even if our laws are very modern, very liberal, but the foreign investment is coming very less. Why? That is question was prevailing upon me. It was because the government authorities, who are the controlling authorities, they are flouting the laws themselves. And there is a collaboration between the businessman and the government authorities to flout the laws. There is a saying in Nepal that everything illegal could be taken as legally. So my question is how to induce the human right notion in their mind with the authorities as well as the businessman. Because human right notion is sidelined by the government, sidelined by the business houses. And I'm wondering that those business houses who comes from advanced countries such as Sweden, Norway, once they enter into Nepal, they do not observe the human rights notions there. They are happy to flout the act itself. So it is a far crying that human rights notions could be induced in the mind of entrepreneur. So what will be the situation in like that? I can preach the human rights conditions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Get a question over here. Surya, if you want to go ahead, and then we had the lady over here.
Okay, thank you. Excellent panel. Two quick questions and comments. Any panelist can reflect on that. The first is that the trade and investment agreements should benefit people at the bottom of the pyramid most. But these agreements are hardly, these people at the bottom of the pyramid are hardly finding any voice in the trade and investment agreement negotiations. They're not on the table. They are not in these rooms. And the actors who are in the rooms do not always represent those voices. So what is then happening is that the trade and investment agreements are enriching those who are already rich. That's my first point. How do we address this? The second issue, and this goes back to the issue of impact assessment perhaps. The second issue is that trade and investment agreements are worsening the asymmetry between the businesses and the affected communities. Because businesses are able to use arbitration to seek access to remedy against governments. But the affected communities do not have any access as third parties. So this is a huge asymmetry which is already there. And trade and investment agreements are making it worse because they are conferring rights on investors, but not the obligations. So how do we fix this imbalance in power about access to justice? And that connects with SDGs as well, access to justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And was it Malin? You had a question?
Thank you. My name's Malin Out. I work at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. So I heard a couple of things from this very interesting panel. One was that we shouldn't take a normative approach, and Stephen Olsen was saying, I think, that trade is becoming politicized. And I think I see where you're coming from with that comment, but I would also argue that this is about norms and about what norms should underlie the international rules-based order. Human rights are about norms, it's about politics and power. And one very prominent example of this is in the ongoing US-China trade war, which is now at the core of this is a discussion around technology, and we're seeing some tech decoupling as a result already, and a coming shift in global supply chains. So my question would be to Geraldson. You mentioned technology. You described technology as a tool for empowerment. But it is, of course, also a potential tool for control and surveillance and espionage, which is really at the core of discussion now between the US and China. And the US has introduced restrictions on Huawei and is also pressuring European countries to restrict Chinese investments. So my question to you is what role do you see that tech companies should play with regard to human rights and civil liberties? And to Stephen Olsen, I note with trepidation, both in Asia and in the US, a revival of the whole Asian values versus Western values debate, and even recently in the US, a debate around a clash of civilizations, which I think is really concerning, because it's really a clash about a clash of political systems, isn't it? Where we need to defend the idea of the universality of human rights.
Thank you. And I've been told this is unfortunately the only round, but hopefully you can catch some of the panelists. My masters, my minders over here have told me this is it. They'll shut off the power in a minute. So we'll start, I think, with that first question about from the gentleman from Nepal about human rights and sort of how one can deal with those in the context of trade. And so Hilda, I don't know if you have some thoughts on that as someone who promotes through the EU these values.
Thank you very much. Well, I would reply to that trade agreements are one element in the equation, but certainly not the only element. And as I have emphasized on the European Union side, we believe that a holistic approach is very important. So it is, we have with countries like Nepal, we have dialogues on all sorts of issues. And it is important that we pass consistent messages in our contacts with that country, also that in our work that we do in the country with civil society, with human rights defenders, that we try to work through all our instruments towards the same goal. Now you will say this is a very fluffy answer, but I think that the reality is complex, consists of many elements, and we cannot just say push that button and the result will be automatically what we wish. That's not how the world turns around. So hammer on the same nail many times in different manners. Make sure that you pass a consistent measure and use every possible lever that you may have to achieve the goal. That's the only recipe, I think, that can work. And make sure that also in the international community you are consistent and united. Thank you.
And then we had another question, Hilda or Ben or others from Syria. One was about voice, right? Civil society voice is not represented in the way we negotiate our trade and investment agreements. So Ben, I don't know if your perspective, and is there anyone else who would like to, and Hilda, to Ben?
Well, yeah, for me the
And again, we've got to be quite sharp. And
the question
brief.
echoes a lot. For example, when Sri Lanka applied to be again beneficiary of GSP Plus at the EU, you saw indeed that civil society was very divided, politicized, but also requested a seat at the table. And in that moment that they, before like, would this be granted or not, that specific political space, that was also granted to them. Now that the GSP Plus is awarded to Sri Lanka, the implementation of that seat of the table in monitoring the conventions is again up for grabs. But you see a lot of interest. You see actually some states moving at a given moment to that and set up a monitoring mechanism domestically that includes civil society. But then again, the question is about follow-up. What are the real commitments? What is being done with it? And can the government of Sri Lanka domestically be held accountable to it? So again, in the run-up to the award of GSP Plus, civil society made exactly the same comment as you. People, workers in the factory, should benefit from this. What will be the benefit? And at a given moment, the Minister of Labor said, okay, I think we should split the benefit 50-50, which I didn't think he thought it through very well, but at least he made the commitment. Yes, that's going to be how we divide the cake. And the question that civil society then took is like, okay, how are we going to calculate that? How are we going to do that? Okay, and they started thinking about mechanisms and increased minimum wage. But then afterwards, again, in the monitoring and the follow-up with the discussions with the EU, they were like, we don't know what is being said, so we don't know necessarily whether this commitment is being followed through. And because we don't know, it's very hard for us to hold them accountable, because we don't even know. If at least we would know that they sort of dropped that commitment in the actual implementation, then at least we could launch a campaign about that. Well, that was in the moment that Sri Lanka still had the political space to do so, but they were very enthusiastic about doing that. And then maybe finally, I think you're totally right. I think a lot of the criticism of civil society, both in the global north and global south, on trade and investment agreements and the GSP systems, is indeed that asymmetry between the ability to complain, to lodge complaints between businesses on the one hand and civil society, effective communities on the other hand. Businesses can complain about anti-trade dumping and about investment, but there's not really a grievance mechanism to handle individual complaints about labor rights violations and human rights violations. And that is, I think, a key architectural element that we need to start developing in the next decades within those trade agreements.
Thanks, and I think Stephen wants to jump in.
Sure.
And do you want to also address the question that you got from
Just two extremely brief comments. First of all, at least in the United States, I think there's a growing recognition that we do have precisely the problem that you described, which is the large companies, the large American multinationals have sort of captured the process of advising on trade agreements, and as a result, the trade agreements disproportionately reflect their best interests. For whatever it's worth, I do think there's a recognition that this is a problem that needs to be corrected, not least of which because an increasing number of people are asking, are the best interests of a large American company necessarily synonymous with the best interests of the United States as a whole? So I think you're going to see that changing. And if there's any word of encouragement I could provide you is over the course of the 30 years that I've been doing this, the role and influence that civil society has had on negotiations has dramatically increased. I expect that to continue to be the case. We're not where we need to be, where we should be, but I think we're getting there. My second quick comment is on this, what you were basically referring to with these remedies was what's known as ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement Provisions in free trade agreements, which basically allow corporations to challenge government policies in tribunals. I think this was a terrible mistake. I've always felt that these ISDS provisions were solutions in search of a problem. I think it became evident that the scales tipped way too far and gave the multinational corporations too much power and were denying countries the domestic policy space that they need in order to enact the policies that rightfully they should. Again, a bit of encouraging, a bit of good news here. I think this problem has been recognized, and what we're seeing methodically is that these ISDS provisions are being pared back substantially to protect that domestic policy space. So I think they're going to be less likely in trade agreements moving forward, and I think to the extent existing agreements have them, they're going to be pared back because I think people are increasingly understanding that they disproportionately gave power to MNCs. On this whole issue of a potential clash of the civilizations, like I'm sure the majority of people in this room, I'm deeply distressed by it. I absolutely bemoan it. The only other comment that I would make, however, is that we've got to be very, very, very careful when we talk about universal values, because it is a big world. And there are a lot of cultures, and not every culture sees these issues precisely the same way an American would or a European would. And so I just point out we have to be aware of that. And I think a lot of the problem with actually implementing labor and other sustainability provisions in free trade agreement is because we throw out a nice word like non-discrimination. And I can tell you something. Non-discrimination means something very, very different in Brunei than it does on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, okay? And I'm not making any judgments about who's right or who's wrong. I'm just saying it's a big and diverse world. It's a challenge, and we've got to deal with it.
Thank you. Very quickly, Gerald, on the technology front, before we wrap up.
Yeah, very quickly. I think it's a tough, contentious subject. In terms of espionage, I think technology is not the issue. If you look at WikiLeaks and Snowden, no matter what technology you have, espionage organizations and governments will go try their best to exploit it. And it's kind of hard for commercial enterprises sometimes to resist laws and sovereign rights to close out your systems. And certainly technology companies have tried. I think what commercial enterprises can do is actually try by design to protect the consumer. And I'll give you an example. At MasterCard, we start our products with privacy by design. We've even started a trust called Truwada that actually is built around GDPR and a lot of the privacy laws to try to protect this. But there's only so much we can do as private enterprise when you've got a lot of seizure type laws, the same laws that allow governments to seize your car in the pursuit of legal action, and allow governments to sort of raid your digital vault under the name of national security. It's a tough one. There's only so much we can do as commercial enterprise.
Right. Thank you all for that. And again, for any of our other speakers, any concluding remarks? Dr. Kim?
Maybe I can just stress one important point. I think the governance, the question is really important because when I was in the Ministry of Transport Infrastructure in Korea, I always felt that everyone from different ministry says their work is important. Environment guy says environment is important. Transport, important. But what is surprising is that since I moved to OECD and ITF, I saw the same phenomenon in OECD and international organizations. We have Environment Directorate, Transport, ITF, governance, and etc. But basically, what is the role of the international community, international organizations? I would say that we have to help to break the silos, because in each government, in each country, it's not easy to break that on their own. Then we need a kind of catalyst and platform through which different sectors can meet together and try to understand. I remember one German intellectual whose name is Erich Fromm, who wrote the book Art of Loving. The first step to love somebody is to know the person better. So we need to break the silos, and that's our main role, to discuss with other sectors. And if we meet, not just to say that we are more important, maybe I would like to let you know more about ourselves. And by doing so, we might have some common interest areas, and we can find some relevant solutions. Of course, solution is not the permanent, but at least in the short term. So I would stress that.
As a professor, I'm also glad to hear you quote from notable economists and scholars as we talk today. Dr. Lin, any last remarks from you? Okay. Well, as we can thank our panelists for a really lively and very wide-ranging discussion on trade and investment and the whole ecosystem. Thank you very much. I'll just conclude by saying that I think for me, hearing from all of you, I think there was a lot of agreement, but the really, Hilda, I think your statement, the cake is as big as we make it, and what we've really heard is from the agreements through the trade promotion right down to the issue of does a woman in a factory actually go home with her wages intact, right, that's what we need to remember. So Gerald, I think you brought this really down to where it needs to be, which is the trade at the top needs to reach everyone at the bottom. And so thank you all. We'll continue this discussion in terms of coherence in Geneva at the Human Rights Council in November, where we will focus on issues like trade and investment and coherence. I hope that we'll continue this larger dialogue because it's very important. So thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, the speakers. And as you can see on the agenda, we don't have a coffee break as of yet. The coffee break will come after the next panel. So thank you one more time for the panelists of the trade session. I would like to invite the panelists for the next session on learning from a practice, accountability, and access to remedy to come on stage and start taking your seats. Before we start, I would just like to make a quick note and remark that there has been some misunderstanding, and our colleagues from the Russian delegation, the issue with the car has been sorted, so apologize for announcing it earlier. And on the next session, learning from practice, accountability and access to remedy, this session will explore the access to remedy landscape in Asia, in the world, and the role of non-judicial mechanisms such as the national contact point and national human rights institutions. We are quite short on time, so that's why there has been this cluttered transition, but... Hi. I know. Yes, please. Okay. Yeah, it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So, just apologies for being the one calling on the time, but we have this mild delay from this morning, so we need to start precisely on time so the session can finish in time for you to have your break and for the deep dive sessions in the afternoon. So, tough job. So thank you so much, everyone. Please take your seat. Our moderator for the session is Professor Aisha Bidin. She's a professor of law of University of Kebangsaan in Malaysia. And joining her on the panel, I would like to call on stage Marte van Putten, the chair of the National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct in the Netherlands. Ankana Nelapajit, Commissioner for the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand. John Burch, National Contact Point for the Responsible Business Conduct in Australia. Elling Rigonsky, Senior Advisor for Human Rights and Business on the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And Bobby Santamaria, Director for Labor Rights in Asia of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So with that being said, you will have this panel up until 11:15 before we break for coffee, and then we come back for the deep dive sessions. I'll come back and explain the afternoon a bit later, but over to Professor Aisha. Floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you, Victoria. Good morning to all, and assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for your patience for waiting, because I know the coffee break is quite tempting outside, but I'm sure we won't be long. So this session is actually on accountability and access to remedy, which is actually basically the third pillar. But I think it's very important that we are aware that access to effective remedy is a core component of the UNGP guiding principle. Even I think we start with UNGP 1, actually stressed on the duty of the state to take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and redress business-related human rights abuses within their territory and jurisdiction. And further on, even in the second pillar, UNGP 22 then also provides business enterprise must identify that they have caused or contributed to the adverse impact, and they should provide cooperation in their remediation through legitimate process. Within the UNGP context, it was envisaged there are 3 types of mechanism to provide access to effective remedy in businesses. One is the state-based judicial mechanism. Then we have also the state-based non-judicial grievance mechanism, and then the non-state-based grievance mechanism. Now, in furtherance to that, we also have the OECD guidelines for the multinational enterprise, which has been actually being cited very frequently during this 2-day event, which also addresses the issue of access to remedy and echoing guiding principle 22, especially in relation to the risk-based due diligence, which enterprise should implement under the guidelines, in which companies must address if they identify harmful effect by way of prevention or mitigation, which must be addressed too. Now, we know that state-based judicial mechanisms are the core of ensuring what we call access to remedy, because their ability for state-based judicial mechanism to address businesses would depend on their impartiality, their integrity, their ability to accord due process. But there are legal barriers for state-based judicial mechanism, and also procedural changes, procedural shortcomings. For instance, litigation, there are issues on costs, there are issues on legal representation, there are issues on inadequate of options, because you talk about class action, derivative actions, where individual actions sometimes tend to be quite ineffective. So that's the reason why the rise of the non-judicial mechanism, especially in terms of NCPs and NHRI, which can be considered as a very integral and important mechanism to complement and supplement the state judicial system. So this session will actually explore in terms of the landscape of access to remedy within Asia and the global, and also will address, I think we'll be listening to real cases, what are the challenges of NCPs and NHRIs, and what are the potential avenues of collaboration. So we have eminent speakers, just now as mentioned by Victoria. I think we have the first speaker, Dr. Madja Van Putten, who's actually from the NCP Netherlands. So Dr. Madja, if you can actually share with us in terms of how does it work, NCP Netherlands, and also in terms of the structure and governance, because we have many NCPs, but perhaps in terms of their approaches and structures might be different. So how does it work in the Netherlands? And perhaps if you can also share with us some interesting cases that we can actually learn from, and also perhaps what are your challenges in looking into this complaint? Yeah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair, and thanks again to the OECD and the other organizers for having this opportunity to talk to you. Indeed, I'm the chair of the Netherlands, the NCP, the National Contact Point of the OECD in the Netherlands. Just for your information, you were mentioning the interesting list of this whole phenomena of grievance mechanisms, accountability mechanisms. One member in that group, little bit different, but still a member to me in the group, could also be the mechanisms of the multilateral financial institutions. I think it's also a moment for the OECD that we have to think about maybe once organizing a sort of exchange of information with those mechanisms of the Asian Development Bank, nowadays including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank from China, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, EBRD London, the European Investment Bank. That was my previous, let's say, working sector. I've been with those banks to begin with the World Bank. But anyway, I see a lot of comparison with what the OECD NCPs do and what those multilateral banks do. So I think we need also an exchange with them. But okay, let me now go to your question, and I hope I can be brief because there's so much to be told and there are more colleagues that want to stress their work. The Dutch NCP, and you're right, it's different from many others, although I think our mechanism is, if you ask us which one looks the most like yours, is probably the one from Norway. The Netherlands, when we started years and years ago, before I was even there, it was an official in the Ministry of Economic Affairs, but this is already long ago. At a certain point, the Parliament decided it has to be an independent mechanism, and the structure is as follows. We have now 4 independent members with different backgrounds, let's say academic backgrounds, social, the employers' organization, and the unions. And they are really independent and supposed also to be impartial in their roles. We have, besides those 4, we have 4 ministries that have members, advisory members in the NCP that is meeting once a month, and we also have an NCP Plus with the unions, with the NGO sector and the employer sector in what we as an NCP, with those 4 independent members and the 4 officials of the ministries, discuss with the sectors what's going on, what cases do we have, what difficulties do we see, all of that. The major role of the NCP is to promote the guidelines of the OECD and to deal with the notifications. That's what we call the cases that arrive. The other task given to us over the years now is also that the government can ask us to do an independent research on let's say, a specific sector. The Dutch government has done a research. They asked Pricewaterhouse to do a research which sectors in the Netherlands were, let's say, tricky towards not adhering to the OECD guidelines, and there was a whole list of 13 sectors. And they asked those sectors to build up a convenant, an agreement with the social partners and others to come with a sort of plan how to reach to come to the guidelines and to recognize them. And one sector was missing. They didn't want to go for a convenant agreement. And that was the oil and gas sector. Well, you can imagine in the Netherlands, the oil and gas sector was not taken. So then the government asked us to do an investigation. We've just published that. What was not really a very nice outcome for the sector, but it's all on the internet. The Dutch Parliament, as I said, is also asking from the NCP to regard its visibility, its accessibility, transparency, impartiality, predictability, and equitability. That's sort of the key words, what they ask from the NCP to keep notice. We also, as an NCP, we expect all stakeholders to act in good faith. And then let me say something about the procedures. The procedures, you can, by the way, find them easily on the website. All our cases are there. When they arrive, even before they are admissible, that's in the procedures, of course, is a case admissible? It's all there. The final outcomes is there. So I highly advise you, if your government is thinking about creating an NCP, to look at a website, and the working procedures, all is there. Normally, when a case arrives, we call it a specific instance is the wording of the OECD, but we call it a case or a complaint in the daily work. We first study and then we make an initial assessment. That's not always understood. When we accept, let's say, when we make an initial assessment, it's not yet a position that we take. It's just, does the case merit? Does it meet the criteria? That's all in. Then if we say yes, the case is admissible, then we offer our good offices, that's also the OECD wording, offering our good offices to the different stakeholders. And then if they accept, we start a whole process that can take some years, and I can give you some examples soon. Then we make the terms of reference with the parties. They have to agree about what are we going to talk. This is, of course, a mediation process. What are the issues? And then, then we have a draft final statement, and we really ask the parties to accept that it is internal, that we don't speak outside about what is going on the table, and that has to be recognized and followed. Yes, I understand. Let me now go to a few cases. The remedy can be different. It can be information and transparency of a company. It can be, well, there are so many cases. Let me just mention a few. The one that was just published was the one of ING on climate change following the Paris Agreement. The outcome was that ING Bank, an international bank, is now the lead in developing its measurement regarding the impact measurement on CO2 emissions. And it was asking together, the parties were asking the Dutch government, including, of course, asking other governments, to demand the International Energy Agency to develop roadmaps on the 1.5 degrees Celsius instead of the 2 degrees, because climate change, the 2 degrees is too small. We should go much further. The other case that I want to mention, and again, there are so many others, was the Heineken case that got a lot of attention, because it was the first time in the OECD context that a specific incident or a case has led to financial compensation outside the court. So far it never happened in the OECD, but this case was about 160 workers in Congo, DRC, that were dismissed during the massacre taking place long ago. But you might remember about today, 20 years ago, Hutus and Tutsis fighting each other. It was a disaster of millions of people that have been killed, and there were 160 workers dismissed, and not even the law from that time in the capital, Kinshasa of DRC, was followed, the social laws of, pension and payments when people are dismissed. It took a while. Taking a case, companies are not always happy. In the beginning they think, why the hell should we go with this process? But it is a matter of, and sometimes you can succeed, to convince them to take the challenge, to go and sit, give it a chance, instead of maybe even finding themselves one day in the international court. So we did it, and I have to say it was a young generation of management of that company that really, when they went for it, they really went for it. And it was an outcome that nobody expected, so let me leave it here maybe for discussion later on. But it was a remarkable outcome. And we have many others, not always successful, but they are successful. We are overloaded at the moment in the Netherlands with cases, and we have in fact a too small staff to run all those cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maja, for that very interesting insights that we heard from your NCP. Next, we have Ankana, Ankana Nila Pajet, and Ankana is actually a commissioner for the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand. Now, as an NHRI, it's quite unique because it has certain mandate in terms of the promotion and protection of human rights. But of course, there's some setback in terms of no enforcement power. Perhaps maybe you'd like also to share with us in terms of how does it work as an NHRI in terms of empowerment of access to remedies, and also perhaps some shared one case perhaps in terms of what are the challenges and that you have to be confronted with by an NHRI Thailand. And we are also aware of the fact that Thailand now is actually the leading country in the ASEAN to come up with the first NAP coming very soon. So I think NHRI Thailand must be working very hard on this particular issue as well. Ankana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and good morning, everyone. As Aisha said, that National Human Rights Thailand is the independent agency under the Constitution of Thailand 2017, and we have the Organic Act on National Human Rights Commission Thailand, so that our main mandate is protection and promotion. We also have another mandate, for example, for advisory function, monitoring function, and building relationships with our stakeholders and other bodies. So our mandate is very wide. For protection mandate is very important because the Human Rights Commission received the complaint from everybody. We can investigate by complaint, or we can investigate without any complaint. And we will work on the report and the recommendations to the government. I will go to some specific cases I want to raise. Firstly, I want to talk about the mining operations in Thailand. From the year 2005 until now, there were more than 48 complaints filed to National Human Rights Commission. And within the concern of the people, there are, for example, the participation, the changing of health and surrounding land rights, and especially remedies to the landowner. Another thing that's very important is about the harassment to human rights defenders. National Human Rights Commission investigate the case and have a recommendation to the government for the mining operation. And on 31st of December 2016, the government responded to our recommendation with the revision of the 1976 Mining Act, so that it will change a lot in the Mining Act 1977. For example, the changing of mindset from sovereign rights of the state to be common heritage of mankind. And secondly, the government have the roadmap on the mining that must have created from a trust building with the people. And another thing is about the meaningful participation of all the stakeholders, and the EIA will make with restriction and rehabilitation remedies and funds provided to the affected communities. Second case I want to highlight is about the community rights defenders. Since 2014, Human Rights Commission investigate a lot of cases of complaint that human rights defenders that face judicial harassment, and we have the report of the harassment in many kinds, for example, open attack, tortures, and enforced disappearance. But now the most harassment is about judicial harassment. And why there are abuses and stress with impunity. And the most concern is about delay of justice. For the investigation of the Commission, we have recommendation to the government, for example, to provide more effective mechanism to protect the community rights defenders, and to speed up the adoption of the draft law on torture and enforced disappearance bill. And now the government changes the law in section 161/1 of the Criminal Procedure Code, so that it is hoped that this will make it easier for court to dismiss the case of harassment and silencing the human rights defenders. I want to speak very briefly about my third concern on the sexual harassment in workplace. The Commission received a lot of complaints of sexual harassment in workplace, and the Commission, after investigation, and we have the recommendation to the government, to the cabinet, and in 2015, the cabinet have agree and adopt the recommendation of the Commission and have the measure to protect human rights, sexual harassment in workplace. It's very sad and very traumatizing for me when I investigate the cases of sexual harassment in workplace, because actually I think everybody thinks that workplace should be a safe place for everyone, but sometimes it's not true. The worst case is about rape and torture, physically and mentally. And most of the victims are affected with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I really appreciate of the working group report on gender dimension, and I hope that Thailand National Action Plan will include the gender lens in National Action Plan, and the state agency will look the mechanism to protect sexual harassment in workplace. So this is my concern.
Thank you, Ankana. We heard that there are some commonalities, similarities with NCP and NHRI, certainly in terms of receiving complaint. And then we further heard that one of the unique features of NHRI is to conduct investigation and conduct inquiry. I think this is one of the powerful mandate, in fact, actually given to NHRI. But it's never easy. It's never easy and always easy, especially when you're dealing with some high-profile cases as well. Thank you, Ankana. We go then to John. John is the senior advisor from the National Contact Point Responsible Business Conduct from Australia. John, perhaps you would like to enlighten us in terms of the structure and governance of the NCP for Australia. Perhaps whether you felt that there are any differences or similarities within the context of the more general framework of NCP, because I do believe that for NCP, in terms of their mandate is twofold, to enhance in terms of the effectiveness of the OECD multinational guideline, and also in terms of receiving complaints and settling it by way of a non-grievance judicial mechanism. So perhaps you can enlighten us in terms of the Australian perspective. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm manager of the Aus NCP Secretariat. We're a small unit of 4 people. We're located in the Australian Treasury as part of our Foreign Investment Division. We've recently actually changed our structure.
Perhaps you'd like to, yes.
Yeah, we've recently changed our structure from quite a small unit that was essentially only the Treasury officers and a little bit of outreach to government to a much more comprehensive structure now. We've probably picked up some of the good processes and behaviours from some of the better performing NCPs. So we have a very consultative structure now. We include civil society representatives on our new governance advisory board. We have representatives from business, both small and large, and we have a broader spread of government representatives. So in terms of being consultative, I think we're heading in the right direction with that. Another change that we've recently put in place is that we've moved to an independent examiner for our case activities. That was a response to a review that we had commissioned that was critical about our ability to be impartial in terms of for instance, Australian companies or whether there were Australian government issues involved. So we've responded to that and we've selected an independent person. Hopefully that's a change that will work out well for us. As I said, we've yet to deal with cases under this new structure, so I'm sure there's a lot of learning still in front of us. In a similar way to my Dutch colleague, we try to promote the guidelines as much as we can. We handle complaints. We've had, I think it's 18 complaints since 2001. We've currently got one active case in our books, but I'm reliably informed by our civil society representatives that that's likely to go up when the new structure is in place as they test how the new arrangements go. Probably reasonably, they'd started to have some concerns about our effectiveness under our previous structure, so hopefully the changes we're putting in place now will address that. I guess my experience, having been in this space for more than 3 years now, is that people generally come to us with concerns. The two main concerns are they're after acknowledgement of their particular problem. They're often after an apology at the same time, and in most cases they're after some kind of compensation. In terms of remedy, sometimes remedy looks like different things depending on what the case is. I was reflecting on some of the cases that we've had, and as my colleague mentioned, we often get really tricky problems, end of the line things, so they're just not easy. One of the cases that I can reflect on that I think is a positive one was a case that we had involving a multinational enterprise, Ansell, that was in respect of its activities in Sri Lanka and in Malaysia. There were some concerns about health problems related to some of its production facilities. We got the parties together. They sat with a mediator. They agreed to work out a solution. They signed up quite a comprehensive memorandum of understanding. So that was positive. Since that's taken place, it hasn't been all smooth sailing, but as we understand, they are working it out, and there's quite a significant and comprehensive package that they're working on to deal through. So we would probably look at that as the best that we've probably seen, and probably a good model for moving forward. I mean, really our involvement, because it was so far away, was relatively light touch, but there was willingness between the parties to get together and work out a solution. So that's a very positive outcome.
Thank you, John. The fact that you mentioned in terms of the diversity in the board, there's also representation from civil society. That's also quite common as well as NHRIs, because most of NHRIs would have one position, one chair from a civil society background, because it's very important actually to work together with the roots, the grassroots. That makes it quite unique compared to other forms of grievances mechanism body. Thank you, John. Then we have Aline here. Aline is currently the chief advisor for the human rights and business from the Danish Institute of Human Rights here, and I think the Danish Institute of Human Rights is, has been very, very aggressively, actively in promoting issues and publication of human rights. Aline, perhaps you would like to share with us in terms of this particular report on the remedy in business and human rights cases, the role of National Human Rights Institution, which is just recently being published in April this year. It's actually, I could like to call it like a companion of a collection of cases of analysis of NHRI roles in relation to remedy, the access to remedy. Aline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and thanks to the organizers for putting this on the agenda. I've been quite surprised to hear a lot of mentions of national human rights institutions in the last 2 days, so I think this is a very positive sign that NHRIs are part of the discussion around business and human rights. I'd just like to start with a little bit of a reminder of what national human rights institutions are, because I think it is important that we don't confuse it, because there's a lot of discussion. So national human rights institutions are established in their own national context by law, and they are supposed to abide by the Paris principles. There's an accreditation process amongst NHRIs to make sure that they live up to certain criteria, including in terms of independence. We have today, I think, 78 A accredited institutions, but those institutions are very diverse. Not all of us do have complaints handling. For example, my own institution, Danish Institute for Human Rights, doesn't have complaints handling, but we have a variety of functions. So we have, and I think there's many Asian NHRIs that are present here. We have commissions, we have institutions, we have ombuds institution, and they operate within the principles, the Paris principles, but have different mandate and functions, and I think that's quite important to be reminded of. Then I also wanted to stress that NHRIs also have been recognized under the Sustainable Development Goals as being an important part of the institutions that do support rule of law. There's a specific target under SDG 16 around the number of A accredited NHRIs. Then I'd like just to make very quick points. The first one is around what NHRIs can do as a non-judicial remedy mechanism, and we already heard from our colleague from the National Human Rights of Thailand what they have been doing. So as I said, there's large variation in the mandate. Some NHRIs, those who have complaints handling, some of them have very broad mandates and can look at basically any type of human rights violations, whereas others might be more restricted, looking, for example, only at non-discrimination cases. However, in terms of the procedures that are being applied by NHRIs, those are often quite similar, mostly use mediation and conciliation. So some NHRIs have quite broad powers in terms of ordering discoveries, accessing documents, etc., but others might be a little bit more restricted. And then, as Aisha mentioned, one of the interesting elements that NHRIs, or one of the interesting approaches, is around national inquiry or public inquiries. So I think what we have seen recently is that NHRIs do not only deal with individual or group complaints that come to them, but they also try to see, on the basis of those complaints or other publicly available information, how they can address a particular issue in a more systematic manner. So Aisha, when you were commissioner, the Malaysian Commission took on a national inquiry, so you would be better placed to talk about that. We've also heard yesterday from our colleagues from the Philippines about this quite innovative approach on an inquiry on climate change. The Australian Human Rights Commission also here is currently concluding an inquiry into sexual harassment in the workplace. So there's a range of different experiences there. In terms of the types of remedy that can be offered, of course, those are mostly of a non-binding nature. It's about recommendations. But this doesn't mean that it's not contributing to a real remedy for victims. I think it is also important to acknowledge that as part of a reparation process, recognition of harm is a very important element. There has been examples where those recommendations have led to concrete changes, reinstatement of workers. Our colleague here from Thailand also mentioned changes in legislation. And then some NHRIs, interestingly, can actually enforce the decisions that they make through courts. This is the case, for example, in Nigeria. But again, there's a very diverse picture, and I think we need to look at that a little bit more specifically. My second point is that it is not only as a non-judicial remedy mechanism that NHRIs can contribute to remedy. There's a range of different experience. I'll not just list them very quickly. One is, for example, our third-party interventions in court cases. Another aspect that we've also heard about is around the legal and policy work that NHRIs are doing. We heard again how national action plans are being developed. NHRIs have played quite a big role in those processes, and a number of them have made specific recommendations on how to strengthen access to remedy. NHRIs in Europe, for example, in France, have made submissions to mandatory due diligence laws, stressing the importance of that type of legislation. Then they can also support and advise victims, including on other remedy mechanisms. And as part of their education and awareness-raising function, they can also support access to remedy. Then let me just conclude on some strengths and challenges, and I hope we can have a bit of a discussion on that. As I said, I think what is interesting is how NHRIs can approach remedy from a systematic angle, and they can look at business and human rights in the context of broader human rights issue in a country. They know not only about business and human rights, but also around other key challenges, and that's quite important to get to the right recommendations. I think also their independence from governments make them a quite unique actor in terms of having the trust from stakeholders. But I think also we need to look at some of the challenges. So one, as I said, is, there's a large mandate, but they also have limited capacity, and we should also try to manage expectations. There's many institutions that are overloaded by cases and cannot necessarily deal with all the requests that do not only come around business, but about all of the human rights challenges in a country. Then I'd also like to stress the pressure under which some NHRIs are. And just to give you one example related to a business and human rights case, the Commission in Nigeria launched an investigation around the human rights impacts of oil spills in Nigeria. And then there's been a lot of setbacks in terms of companies challenging the jurisdiction of the Commission in front of the court as to whether they could take on that type of investigation. And then I'll pass all the political pressures on NHRIs. Then maybe just to finish on cross-border cases, because I think that's one of the areas that is of most interest and maybe the most innovative ways. I think there are some NHRIs that have interpreted their mandate in a way that they could look at cross-border cases, and this is very interesting, but I also think that not all of the NHRIs can be that creative. Some of us might be more restricted in the mandate. However, the fact that we are many NHRIs in different countries also means that we can collaborate amongst NHRIs, and I think we'll discuss the collaboration with NCPs in a minute.
Thank you, Aline. I couldn't agree with you more. Being, in fact, a former human rights commissioner, I feel in terms of the pressure that actually is put forward in terms of us, especially in terms of conducting national inquiries and public inquiries. Sometimes the Commission, Human Rights Commission, receive tremendous pressure, actually, from the government, from the authorities, and so forth. But the fact that it's an independent body and it is a advisor to the government and a conduit also working together with grassroots, that added strength very much to national human rights institution. And I guess that is the strength for NCPs and NHRIs, very much actually the ability to work together and get that kind of trust, actually, from the grassroots. We then go to the second round, in which I would like to then get the views of Bobby Starr-Maria. Yeah, Ms. Bobby Starr-Maria at the moment is the Director for Labor Rights and Asia at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, right? Bobby, now the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is said to be the largest NGO dealing with business and human rights, and actually is a provider of very wealth of information on your website. So you play a very crucial point in terms of facting information, yeah, to organizations like the government, like NCPs and HRIs and the others. But at the same time, I think in a way, I was informed that you also publish internal statement in terms of effect implications of harmful effect of companies. So in that context, within that context, can you perhaps discuss and brief to us, how does your center then actually facilitate access to remedies? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Aisha. I think we have the largest available information on business and human rights, not necessarily the largest organization. And so as the main global source of information on business and human rights, I think the part of our work that's most relevant in this discussion is the way that we track all of these complaints, outcomes, commentaries, and relevant developments related to national contact points and human rights institutions. And in terms of our ultimate goal in that work of tracking those cases and developments, it's something that we all share in this panel. It's that we want to counter impunity for human rights abuse, and therefore we want to promote access to remedy and at the same time strengthen these mechanisms. So in practical terms, that means we gather and disseminate information around these mechanisms to workers, communities, NGOs, human rights defenders, advocates, so that they can be used effectively in the work of holding companies accountable. We work closely not only with the complainants themselves, but also with groups like OECD Watch, for example, whose work is dedicated to promoting access to these, to the NCPs in particular, and also to strengthening them. So we also like to amplify good outcomes to set leadership examples, and at the same time we want to highlight concerns as they are raised around these mechanisms in order to provide that challenge and that motivation for strengthening these. And in our work throughout all of these tracking efforts, I'd like to point out 5 main observations I think is relevant in this conversation. One is that the building of these cases, the development of these complaints and submissions is actually hard work for the communities and workers involved. It requires a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of technical skill. The second is that not only are these complaints and processes resource intensive, they also actually bring actual risks of retaliation. And in fact, we just put out a fact sheet in partnership with OECD Watch about the potential role of contact points in protecting human rights defenders. And some of the findings that we include in that fact sheet are that there are recorded incidences of reprisals that have come out of after a complaint is filed or after a complaint is concluded, a case is concluded. These go in the form of intimidation that has led some NGO leaders, for example, to go into hiding. There are cases of threats involving threatening at gunpoint for NGO workers to drop the case. There has been a recorded case of an NGO being sued for defamation, and sadly also a case of assassination that has come after the conclusion of a case. So it's hard, resource intensive, and dangerous. But as my third point, sometimes these mechanisms are the best hope that communities and workers have to be heard and for their pleas to be considered. There are a lot of features that allow them to be so, like for example, the extraterritorial application, especially if when it comes to the contact points, they are broad in terms of their coverage of sectors and value chains, and also they have far-reaching expectations as far as the responsibility of corporations or companies is concerned in terms of accounting for their negative impact. So on that point, even in cases where facilitating a remedy or enforcing a remedy is a challenge, sometimes just the mere act of hearing a complaint either by a human rights institution or by a contact point, in itself is a public acknowledgement of the harm that companies have done, and this is meaningful to victims and survivors of abuse. As a fourth point, it's that ultimately these mechanisms contribute to creating a culture of accountability. We do this work because we want companies to know that when there are abuses, they will be investigated and that there will be appropriate remedies. And just as a last point, sadly to date, we find that meaningful remedy through these particular mechanisms, and for various reasons, are still quite hard to come by. And I'd like to refer very quickly to the most recent State of Remedy report of OECD Watch, where in 2018, out of 34 concluded cases, only 11 made it to mediation, and of those 11, only 4 reached some kind of agreement. So this is a pretty low success rate in terms of achieving remedy is concerned. And also an interesting data point is 12 of these were filed by communities or NGOs, and among those 12, only 2 resulted in some sort of remedy. So it just goes to show that the hard work that advocates put into these complaints, and also that the commissions themselves and the contact points themselves put into the process, you know, it's important. It contributes to fighting impunity. Ultimately, we want this work to lead to fairer societies, but there's a lot of work to be done, and I guess as a final point, I'd like to emphasize the need for just constant improvement, and this has been highlighted by our Australian colleague, wherein there's always room to constantly improve, and we need to do so in order to maintain the trust and confidence of the groups that we want to serve.
Thank you, Bobby. Certainly, I think the intensity of the complaint that you receive and the kind of work expectation also from your stakeholder does actually provide sometimes pressures, of course, with dealing with the issues as well. But the role, I think we cannot underestimate the role played by your organization in that sense. Perhaps maybe on this round, we can actually discuss in terms of exploring avenues for cooperation between NHRIs and NCPs. Let's start with you, John, from NCP Australia. I mean, do you actually work with the NHRIs, other NHRI, or from Australian NHRI, and or with other NCPs from other jurisdictions? And do you think that is important as far as collaboration is concerned in terms of to add the effectiveness of the workings of NCPs?
Thank you for the hello. Thank you for the question. Look, absolutely, and it's a very timely question because one of the things I failed to acknowledge before, and my apologies to my colleagues from Australia for this, is that in our changes to our structure, we've brought our NRHI, the Human Rights Commission, onto our Governance Advisory Board. Prior to that, to be really honest, we didn't have a whole lot to do with them. And that was our fault, our failure. But happily, having them at the table is already starting to reap benefits. They're here. We're meeting with them at events such as this. We're certainly planning to lean on their expertise in this area. They've got their own complaints handling mechanisms. Hopefully they can make us be better in terms of the way we deal with cases. So sure. In the past we haven't, but now we're certainly increasing our engagement. And also, before I finish, I'd like just to acknowledge my colleague's comment, which I think really cut through for me, and that is that when some people are critical of NCPs being a non-judicial mechanism, don't let that stop you from using us. We can help, and I really liked her comment about sometimes these sorts of things are the only opportunity for people to have a voice. So I strongly support that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Aline, I think from the study, the report study, now perhaps maybe you also like to enlighten us in terms of what are your thoughts on the benefit of increased collaboration between NCPs and NHRI from the same country, from different jurisdictions, and how could such collaboration be achieved?
Thanks. First, I'd like to mention that there is a MOU between the Global Alliance of NHRIs, GANRI, and the OECD with a view to foster those collaborations. But I think it's really in recent years that we see that it is progressing. Australia being one example. There are a couple of other examples where there's either the NHRI being part of the institutional setup of the NCP in countries where both of those institutions exist, or where there might be a sort of an MOU for when the NCP receives a human rights related case, that it could seek the expertise of an NHRI. And I think that's pretty important. I can't remember the statistics, but if I remember well, an overwhelming number of the cases received by NCPs are actually around Chapter 4. And some of our colleagues in national human rights institutions have a wealth of experience and expertise in terms of dealing with human rights cases. And another thing that we need to strengthen is where there is an NCP in a country, but where there is no national human rights institution, but also when an NCP investigates, I don't know if you use that term, but let's say you do, a case in another country, then reach out to the NHRI. They know a lot about the human rights situation. I'm sure the SUHACAM could have helped with understanding what are the challenges that companies face in the country, what are the systematic issues, what are the recurrent violations. And then, you know, one idea that I think we also need to explore is to see how NHRIs could also file specific instances to NCPs, because, you know, when we don't have the mandate, maybe that is something that we could look at.
Yeah, thank you, Aline. Especially your last point in terms of the collaboration to NCP and NHRI, especially when relating to transboundary issues. And certainly, I think within the mandate of the Act, there are limitations for some NHR in dealing with transboundary cases and extraterritorial. That's where I think the complementary and supplementary of the NCP would certainly assist a great deal in terms of how the case should be brought forward here. Maja, from the NCP Netherlands perspective, now, do you have some kind of also collaboration with the Dutch NHRI and also perhaps NHRI with other countries or non-adherent OECD countries, and in what form and structure? And how do you see this collaboration in strengthening your NCP Netherlands in leveraging access to remedies?
It's a very important question, and I realized coming here that, of course, we know the National Human Rights Institute in the Netherlands. There's also one there. But I have to admit that we have been so busy that it's too little time, and after, well, having been here, I already made it an issue of our annual, let's say, coming together to discuss our work. Are we still in the right track? I put this on the agenda, so we have to go and see them again and talk. But maybe it's also, as you say, the transboundary. I think it's a very important issue, not only with the National Human Rights Institute, but also between the NCPs. We have, first of all, we have cases. For example, we've now a case with Nissan. It's about with the Japanese NCP, the French NCP, the American NCP, and the Dutch NCP. We all four received on the same issue a complaint, or a case, and we have to work together. And it also, so that's one thing, that it is a global issue. We live in a globalized world, so there is no other way. This is the way we have to go to work together. And it reminds me of something that the previous chair of the Belgium NCP recently said. He said, we have a trouble. Sometimes you think that you have the grip on a company and there is a case in front of you. By the time you're dealing with it, the company has gone to another country. So this is the sort of world that we are in, that we have to act really cross-border. In that sense, we're all one village maybe already. It's, we have to work together.
Certainly. Ankana, Well, certainly in your experience, at the moment, Thailand does not have an NCP yet, yeah. But in your kind of work for Thailand, I mean, you certainly would need to work with other human rights organizations and other NHRI from other jurisdictions as well. Now, how do you see such collaboration? What does it add to the strengthening of your own commission in empowering the access to remedies?
Thank you, Aisha. As Thailand have no NCP, but the role of National Human Rights Commission is, I think, is similar to NCP, especially the role of investigation. And we collaborate with all the stakeholders, the government agencies, civil society, and human rights defenders and the affected communities as well. And I think that many times that the NGOs or maybe the affected communities, they can use our report in the court. And many times that the court invited the commissioner or the representative of our commission to present the report in the court, so that it will be benefit to the victims of human rights violation. For the remedies, I think there's many kinds of remedies. Sometimes we can give recommendations to the government about the remedies, or maybe for example, the public apologize for some cases, especially the sexual harassment. I think when for the statutory obligation, I think it's very good question for collaboration with the human rights institution in the regions. And last month, I went to Malaysia to join the Suhakam on the report of human trafficking at the border of Thai and Malaysia. We have a lot of cases of transboundary violations. So I think that now the human rights institution in ASEAN, we have the CNF, and it will be good if we can collaborate and sharing the evidence-based fact-finding and the report, so that we can support each other to protect our people in the region.
Okay, thank you, Ankana. Well, we should proceed with the questions. You shouldn't take more time then. Yeah, please, we can have a few questions from the floor. Yeah, you have one question there. Any more questions there? Number 2 and number 3. Okay, we take 3 questions first. Yes, if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Malin Out. I work at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden, and we work also here in Asia, bringing together NHRIs and courts and business in a blended learning course on business and human rights and the environment and human rights. And it's just so inspiring to learn about the work that the NHRIs in the region here are doing. And interestingly, Sweden doesn't have an NHRI, and we have a very weak NCP. So I would also just like to encourage all the governments in the room to continue to encourage Sweden to establish an NHRI through the UPR review. But yes, mainly just to say thank you for the inspiration here in Asia.
Yeah, thank you. We take it very positively then. Yeah, thank you, Marlena. Yeah, second question, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Joseph Wild. I coordinate the OECD Watch Network and work for the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations, an Amsterdam-based NGO. Thanks for the great presentations, and especially to Bobby for mentioning some of our joint research that we've done recently. I just want to make a quick contrast with the previous panel where we were talking about trade and investment, and that the system, the ISDS system that's in place for companies to bring complaints against countries who they feel have encroached on their investment, and how strong that system is and how efficient that system is at getting remedy for the companies when they feel like their investments have been encroached upon, compared to what we've been talking about here, and we've been hearing from NHRIs, how difficult it is, NCPs, of course we know the difficulties, and how ineffective the system that's set up to access remedy for victims of human rights abuse is. And we've been talking, of course, here about non-judicial remedies. But really, I think if you want to look to a very effective system of remedy, we need to look to judicial remedies and legal laws in place. And just wanted to ask the panel to reflect a little bit on some of the initiatives, mechanisms out there, what needs to be done to move towards a more effective system of judicial remedy. There are processes, for example, at the UN Human Rights Council, a treaty on business and human rights is being negotiated that has, I think, a lot of potential for setting up a process, a system for effective access to judicial remedy. There are in a number of particularly European countries right now processes on mandatory due diligence that would potentially also allow access to remedy through judicial mechanisms, and to just reflect a little bit on the relationship here between the non-judicial and what's needed for the judicial real effective remedy. Thanks.
Okay, right. More in terms of what perhaps are the initiative and mechanisms to improve in terms of the judicial mechanism, right? Thank you. Maybe the third question, yes?
Thank you. This is Panindra Gautam, Ministry of Law and Justice, Nepal. I also do agree with the earlier speaker from OECD. While we talk about access to remedy, there are questions of jurisdiction. Suppose product of company A in country A are used by the people living very far in another country, and the company may not have physical presence in that country. Or in other case, as already the delegates from Netherlands pointed out, such companies just run away once the case is initiated. In this situation, either we talk about judicial or non-judicial remedies, unless and until there is a robust mechanism under which these companies, which causes devastating impact on human rights of people living far behind, need to have some sort of accountability or some robust mechanism to implement the human rights violation cases. From this perspective, I think we need to think, and I want some intervention from the panel on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, so more on issues relating to jurisdiction. How do you, normally this is quite a very crucial point that you have to decide first in terms of the local standard, right? So how does perhaps these issues be dealt with by NCPs and NHRIs? Perhaps we can have another question before we go back to, yes, Michael?
In relation to this, just come straight to the point. I'm coming from the industry, and I'm talking about labor rights. So we already have our own legislations. Actually, what I felt that this is another layer. So going through this process, in any event when there's a human rights or labor rights wrongdoing, I refer to labor rights wrongdoing, we have our processes, which is a very long journey as well. We will start with conciliation meetings, right? And that doesn't succeed, then it goes to the tribunal. And that will take us to another process. And even if the claimant or the parties is not satisfied with, can still take it to the civil courts. And at the end, we end up with the federal courts. That probably be another 3 years of thing. So I just wonder that if we have this NHRI who is also involved, engaged with some rights issue, employment also has what you call it, breaches of human rights abuses. It's bound to happen in any organization. So one is binding, the legal part is binding in the country, okay, and but this layer again that we do this, having another NCP and another process, is this duplication? And I just wonder whether that the industry has got so much resources, do they have so much resources to face all these things at the same time when there's also the local legislation, which is a sovereign law of the country, and this is something else which I was always wondering that how many set of rules do we have to manage while we are in the business? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can put forward to the speakers, perhaps in terms of the initiative mechanism to in other words, to empower judicial remedies. Yeah, as the question just now, perhaps maybe Aline, would you like to discuss this, and also Maja, maybe in terms of the cases that you have taken in? And as far as the issue of jurisdiction, I suppose this is a common issue that's faced by NCPs and NHRI, maybe Ankana and John would like to do that. And now, in terms of the duplication issue between NCPs and NHRI, Bobby, you deal with both aspects, right? Perhaps you would like to maybe give your views on that. So perhaps maybe we can start with Aline. Yeah?
Sure. Well, you know, if there was an easy answer, Joseph, we wouldn't be here. But I think, you know, we have to look at the system that we're in, sort of, you know, there's domestic level where you have an interaction between non-judicial mechanisms and then judicial mechanisms, and then you have the global outlook. But I think we obviously need to strengthen the access to judicial mechanisms. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that there will be a place that is needed for non-judicial remedy mechanisms at the local level. I mean, you know, looking at reality, and I think my colleagues from national human rights institutions in this region are better placed than me to say that. But in terms of accessibility to the people, it is where victims have an easier access rather than even court. It's easier to reach out to national human rights institutions. Some of them have regional offices down in the different regions of the countries where they operate. Than going to a court, but even more than that, going to another country. And in terms of cost, I mean, you know, those discussions we've had many times. So I think, you know, there is, as I think it's, I don't know if it's Surya who has put that expression forward of the ecosystem of remedy, but I certainly believe that there's an interaction between all these elements. On the treaty, I think, you know, it's also interesting discussion. How can an international binding instrument be reinforcing also access to remedy within the state where harm occurs, in states where harm originated from? Is there a place for an interaction between these? But again, I think, you know, it's going to be extremely long. It's going to be complicated to set up judicial collaboration between home and host states systems. So I think, you know, we also need to work now with dealing with very concrete complaints from people, and I think there's a space for these non-judicial remedy mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you, Aline. I mean, especially when you mentioned about the legal binding instrument, a document that's being discussed at the moment. There's still, you know, a long way in terms of the draft and so forth, and there are quite also a number of criticism against the particular draft as well. But I think we are perhaps on the right track. Actually, you know, we're looking into avenues and exploring various opportunities and mechanisms in that sense. Maja, would you like to add in terms of this particular issue?
Yeah, there's a lot in mind. There's so much asked here. But allow me to make also a remark towards Mrs. Out from Sweden. I think it's true, Sweden, of course, from Northern Europe, being from the Netherlands, also Northern Europe, it's still a big surprise for us that the NCP is very, well, let's say, in a corner on the ministry, and that you don't have the National Human Rights Institute. We can only support you so much to bring this message towards Sweden, because it's a surprise. We feel so common as Dutch and Swedish and Danish and what have you. How come you don't have it? But okay, that's a remark I want to make. The other thing on the non-judicial systems, even the judicial systems, I think yesterday I made that remark in when we had the climate change issue. It's an environmental issue. There's the International Court in The Hague, and there has been a judge, I understand it was a judge from Sri Lanka, in the court who said, unfortunately he died, I think recently, he has made quite strong remarks in the court that we miss international law on environment. And environment today is a big issue. Having here so many UN institutions and international institutions around, I think looking at climate change and water issues and health and air pollution, what have you, it's global issues. We need international environmental law and climate law, etc. So that's a judicial system. But I want to use this momentum to repeat that remark. But now coming to the use of the let's say the non-judicial systems. That's in fact your question. If there should be non-judicial or judicial, let me return the question to you. Do you think that are they, let's say, brothers and sisters, or do you think it's a preference that there is in every national state a right judicial system? I'm still puzzled with this. It's not one or the other, it's both probably, depending on the country. If the country has enough sources to have a proper judicial system, that's today also an issue because of tax incomes diminishing more and more because of globalization. That's another issue, maybe not for this conference, but you see that states have less and less income, so even the proper judicial systems are under pressure. Also in the Netherlands, I can tell you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Major. Perhaps regarding the issues of jurisdiction, perhaps maybe John and Ankara, very briefly, maybe to highlight your views. How do you deal with issues of jurisdiction in your kind of work?
I want to have a quick response on the judicial remedies. I think it's very challenging to the National Human Rights Commission because especially for the extraterritorial obligations. Firstly, I want to mention about the conflict of law. For the case of litigation in one country, and then with implementation and remedies have to give in to the affected communities in another country. Because we not have like the inter-Asian law or other collaboration. And another thing I want to mention is about the rights to fair trial of everybody. That I think is very important, and the victims and their affected community must guarantee on their safety when they submit their case to the court. Witness protection is also very important. Some of the affected community withdraw their case because they cannot tolerate to threat. And even the Human Rights Commission themselves, sometimes if they are under pressure or stress as well. As a threat is very widespread in our region, so I think that we have to work together really strongly, the Human Rights Commission, civil society, and affected community, how we can support the victims and support the court also, so that the victims can access to effective remedies.
Yes, thank you, Ankara. John, final remarks, yeah, regarding the issue?
Look, actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up something that Joseph said in his question, because I think it's an important one, and it probably needs to be addressed. That is that, I mean, where you have, we have systems like ours that are voluntary for business to be involved. My observation sometimes is that when we get in touch with a company that that doesn't even know that we exist, so the first interaction we have, they're saying, well, who are you and what's this all about? That their inclination generally is to lawyer up. And we might not actually see the person we need to see, and we'll see a lawyer, and it becomes a very difficult conversation. But when they've realised that we're non-judicial and it's voluntary and so on, you kind of see them relax a bit, and they're willing to have the discussion, and they're not so concerned. And I think if it was all judicial, you'd lose a lot of the richness that we get out of this and a lot of the opportunities. So, but I do acknowledge your point that sometimes whatever you get, you're going to get people lawyering up, and they're not going to want to talk. And so, you might want to think about how do we actually compel them to do this. But I think we would lose a lot, and so I'm just perhaps acknowledging that.
Thank you, John. I was informed that a representative from Sweden would like to make some clarification on your NCPs. Yeah? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm the ambassador of Sweden. Not to defend ourselves, I think we have a deficit, and I think the idea from my colleague Malin to have these kind of issues raised with Sweden and other countries in the UPR. That's excellent examples of how we should work. I mean, the recommendation to Thailand to develop a national action plan for business and human rights came out of that kind of process from us and others. Luckily, this deficit has been seen by our government as well. So in the government program presented January this year, there is specific commitment to establish an independent national human rights institution. But there was a specific question asked to us, why isn't it there already? And I think one explanation, and Malin is probably better informed about this, but my guess is that the history of the parliamentary ombudsman and the anti-discrimination ombudsman has played a major role. When I felt, and my fellow soldiers 40 years ago, when we felt that our rights had been violated by the major in our regiment, then we turned to the parliamentary ombudsman and complained. We had a list of, I think, 9 complaints, and he was convicted on, I think, 5 of those complaints and had to pay a fine. So that was the kind of, I felt that my human rights were well taken care of in that system. Though we ought to have better mechanisms, as many countries, so we should improve, as should we all do. But I think that that is one of the explanations. The parliamentary ombudsman is there, has a long history, well established, well known, and the anti-discrimination ombudsman on LGBTI rights, gender equality, disability, those are there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Even this idea of ombudsman, sometimes, like in Malaysia, there are issues of to setting up an ombudsman, but there are also voices saying that it might duplicate as well in terms of the other NHRI mechanisms and so forth. But for Sweden, I think you have a lot of support from other NHRI. I believe that there's gunnery in terms of the UN working group as well. I'm sure that the NHRI in this particular conference hall would be happy to assist you, in sharing experience for that. But perhaps maybe I'd just like to conclude, Victoria. I know that she's keep on staring at me, but perhaps maybe just a few key takeaways that we cannot work in isolation, NCPs or NHRP. We are just mechanism in terms of advancing the effectiveness of access to remedies. We cannot work in a silo. And as you can see from today's session, we can see there's some shortcomings and challenges faced by NHRIs and NCPs. The factors or gaps within the judicial system can be addressed within the non-state judicial mechanism, and you can see, for instance, in terms of the dynamics of the public inquiries, national inquiries by NHRIs, in which we can actually admit evidence which are not admissible in a court of law, how unique it is, and also, of course, the strong support from the grassroots and advice of the government. So on that note particularly, I think please join me to give a round of applause for this brilliant performance by the speakers. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you to the panel, and apologies for the rude intervention. We are running out of time, so that's why we're rushing for this afternoon. As you know, we have a short coffee break now, but the next session starts at 11:45 sharp, so please be on time. This is the last plenary interaction before 4 p.m. today, if I'm not mistaken, so please have a look into the calendar of events for this afternoon. Please take a picture, look at it, check the rooms for your sessions, and be noted that at 11:45 sharp, the deep dive sessions will start. Okay? Thank you. Have a nice coffee break.